there. My Twilight Souls. Tonight, we journey through the hidden secrets of breaking dawn, the final chapter where mortal life surrenders to immortality, where impossible biology defies every law of vampire nature, and where the gathering storm of ancient power threatens to destroy everything in the name of justice that masks darker ambitions. Breaking Dawn contains layers beneath its surface story. Secrets woven into wedding preparations and honeymoon darkness and birth that should never have happened, and confrontation that rewrote vampire politics forever. I'm trying my best to make these videos with my whole heart, and sometimes I doubt if it's really worth all the effort. But your comments make me feel seen and remind me why I'm doing this. I'm hoping to reach 1,000 subscribers soon. I'm close, but not there yet. If you'd like to support a small creator and this little community we're building, please consider subscribing. Thank you. Now, let these hidden secrets carry you gently into rest as we uncover what lies beneath the surface of the saga's final chapter. The wedding preparations that consumed the Cullen household throughout the summer of 2006 were orchestrated primarily by Alice Cullen, whose precognitive visions shaped every detail from the angle of morning light through the trees to the exact moment when clouds would part for the ceremony, and the precise emotional peaks that each guest would experience as Bella Swan married Edward Cullen in the union that Alice had been planning in her mind since the moment she had first seen visions of Bella joining their family years earlier. Alice's gift made her the perfect wedding planner, but also made her obsessive in ways that sometimes frustrated Bella, who wanted simplicity, while Alice insisted on perfection that would match the vision she had seen of Bella's happiness and Edward's joy, and the family celebration of the union that would precede Bella's transformation into the vampire she was destined to become. The visions Alice experienced were not simply about aesthetic perfection, but were deeply emotional explorations of possible futures, where different choices led to different outcomes and different levels of happiness or regret or disaster that could unfold from seemingly minor decisions about flower arrangements or seating charts or the timing of the ceremony itself. She saw futures where rain ruined outdoor ceremonies, and futures where Bella tripped walking down the aisle, and futures where various guests caused scenes or created problems that would mar the celebration, and she adjusted every plan to avoid these negative outcomes and to guide events toward the future she had seen, where everything was perfect and everyone was happy, and Bella's last day as human ended in beauty and in love rather than in chaos or in disappointment. The obsessive attention to detail was not vanity, but was love expressed through Alice's unique gift, her desire to give Bella the perfect wedding that Alice herself had never experienced as human, because she had no memory of her human life, and no knowledge of whether she had ever been loved or celebrated or given the kind of day that marked life transitions and created memories that would last forever. The werewolves created blind spots in Alice's visions that frustrated her planning and created anxiety about elements she could not control or predict. Jacob Black's potential attendance being one significant unknown that made Alice uncomfortable because she could not see whether he would come, or whether his presence would create problems, or whether the Quileute Pack's hatred of vampires would manifest in violence or disruption during the ceremony, when humans and vampires would gather together in unprecedented proximity. Edward's decision to invite Jacob was calculated and was manipulative in ways that revealed his understanding of psychology and his willingness to use emotional leverage to achieve outcomes he believed were necessary. His recognition that Bella needed closure with Jacob before transformation, and that Jacob's absence would haunt her and would create regret that might poison her happiness in ways that his presence could prevent, despite the pain that seeing Jacob might cause her. The phone call Edward made to Billy Black's house was carefully scripted to provoke Jacob's return. His word choices designed to suggest that Bella was in danger or was making terrible mistake, and that Jacob's intervention might still be possible if he came back to Forks before the wedding, made Bella's choice permanent and irrevocable. The Denali clan's absence from the wedding created the first crack in relationships that would eventually lead to catastrophe, that nearly destroyed the Cullen family and nearly resulted in execution by Volturi authority, that recognized no appeals and accepted no excuses when vampire law was violated or appeared to be violated. Irina Denali refused to attend the wedding because the Cullens had an allied with the werewolves who had killed Laurent during his attempt to kill Bella in the meadow, where he had found her alone and vulnerable, and had decided to feed despite his previous promises to stay away from Forks and to respect the Cullen territory and the treaty that protected humans in the area from vampire predation. Laurent had been Irina's lover in the casual way that nomadic vampires sometimes formed attachments that were not permanent mate bonds, but were genuine affection and genuine companionship that made his death painful for her and made his killers her enemies regardless of whether his death had been justified by his attempt to murder innocent human girl who had done nothing to deserve being hunted. The history between Laurent and Irina stretched back decades to when he had been part of James's coven and had followed the Tracker and Victoria through their nomadic existence across North America and occasionally across other continents when prey became scarce or when human populations became too aware of disappearances and began organizing hunts or investigations that made feeding dangerous. Laurent had split from James and Victoria after the baseball game encounter in Forks, when he had recognized that James's obsession with hunting Bella would lead to confrontation with the Cullens and probable death for anyone who remained loyal to the Tracker, whose gift made him arrogant and made him underestimate opponents who might be stronger or smarter or more motivated than he anticipated. His decision to visit the Denali clan in Alaska had been survival instinct and had been good judgment that saved his life temporarily and introduced him to Irina, who found him attractive and found his attempts to adopt vegetarian lifestyle admirable, even when those attempts were not entirely successful and were not entirely sincere. Irina's grief over Laurent's death was complicated by her knowledge that he had been attempting to kill Bella, and that the werewolves had been protecting her, and that their violence had been defensive rather than being unprovoked murder. But grief does not always respect logic, and does not always accept justifications that make intellectual sense. When emotional pain demands revenge, or demands justice, or demands acknowledgement that the loss mattered, and that the dead person's life had value regardless of what they had been doing when they died, her refusal to attend the wedding was protest, and was boundary, and was declaration that she would not celebrate alliance with her lover's killers, and would not pretend that everything was fine when she was still mourning and still angry, and still wanting someone to be held accountable for the death that had taken her companion and left her alone. Tanya Denali's position as leader of her coven made Irina's absence diplomatically complicated and personally painful. Her attempts to convince Irina to reconsider and to attend the wedding for the sake of maintaining the centuries-old friendship between the Denali clan and Carlisle Cullen, creating family tension that divided the sisters and created resentment that would persist long after the wedding ended and long after Bella's transformation was complete. Tanya understood Irina's grief, but also understood that Laurent's death had been consequence of his own choices, and that holding grudge against the werewolves or against the Cullens for allying with them was irrational and was potentially dangerous because it created division at a time when vampire politics were becoming increasingly unstable and when maintaining alliances was crucial for survival in world where the Volturi's absolute authority was being quietly questioned by covens who resented being ruled by Italian vampires whose power came from their gifts rather than from any legitimate claim to leadership. The foreshadowing that Irina's absence created was invisible to everyone at the time, but would become painfully obvious months later when her report to the Volturi about the immortal child she believed she had seen in the woods near Forks would bring the entire Volturi Guard to Washington to investigate and to execute the Cullens for violating the most sacred law in vampire civilization, the law that protected their species from exposure and protected vampire children from being created when their inability to control bloodlust and their inability to keep secrets made them existential threats to everyone around them. The crack that appeared during the wedding preparations would widen into chasm that nearly swallowed everyone the Cullens loved and everyone who allied with them in the confrontation that would occur on Snowy Field in late December, when two vampire armies faced each other and came within moments of battle that would have killed dozens and would have changed vampire politics forever. Charlie Swan's quiet heartbreak during the wedding preparations was visible to anyone who knew him well enough to read his silences and his careful distance from the celebrations that were taking his daughter away from him in ways he did not fully understand but instinctively recognized as permanent and as final, despite everyone's assurances that Bella would visit and that their relationship would continue after the wedding. His cop instincts told him that something was wrong with the Cullens and that Bella was involved in something dangerous, and that the wedding was not simple marriage between two young people who loved each other, but was transition into world he could not see and could not protect her from, no matter how much he wanted to keep her safe from harm. The suit shopping expedition with Edward had been awkward male bonding that neither of them enjoyed, but both endured for Bella's sake. Charlie's attempts at father of the bride warnings about treating his daughter well, meeting Edward's perfectly polite assurances that he would love Bella forever and would never hurt her and would give her everything she wanted, even when what she wanted was transformation into vampire, who would live forever and would never age and would never die. The relationship developing between Charlie and Sue Clearwater provided comfort and provided distraction from his grief about losing Bella to marriage, and eventually to the mysterious illness that would keep her away from Forks for months and would change her in ways that Charlie would never fully understand, but would eventually accept, because the alternative was losing her completely and never seeing her again, and never meeting the granddaughter whose existence was impossible and whose nature was unprecedented in vampire history. Sue understood loss because she had buried her husband Harry after his heart attack and had raised 2 children who had become werewolves without her knowledge or her consent. Her experience with the supernatural world of the Quileute tribe making her better equipped than most humans to accept strangeness and to live with secrets that could never be fully explained or fully revealed without creating danger for everyone involved. Bella's secret farewell to her human life happened in private moments that she did not share with Edward or with her family. Her visits to places that had meaning to her human existence, creating closure and creating grief about what she was choosing to leave behind, when transformation made her immortal and made her vampire, and made her unable to return to the simple human experiences that had defined her life before Edward Cullen had walked into her biology class and had changed everything forever. She drove to the meadow where she and Edward had spent afternoons talking, and where Laurent had tried to kill her, and where Victoria's army of newborns had trained before the Cullens and the werewolves had destroyed them in battle, that had tested alliances and had demonstrated that cooperation between enemies was possible when survival demanded it. She walked the beach at La Push, where she had learned the truth about Edward's nature from Jacob, and where she had spent time with friends who were now werewolves protecting their tribe from the very vampires Bella was joining through marriage and through transformation, that would make her their natural enemy despite their history, and despite Jacob's love for her, that had not disappeared simply because she had chosen Edward. The letter Bella wrote to her mother Renee remained unsent and remained hidden among her belongings. Her attempt to explain her choices and to say goodbye to the parent who had given birth to her and had raised her and had loved her in scattered, distracted way that had made Bella the parent in their relationship and had made Bella responsible and careful in ways that most teenagers never developed. The letter explained nothing and explained everything, her words careful and vague because she could not tell her mother the truth about vampires and transformation and immortality, but wanted to convey that she was happy and was loved and was choosing the life she wanted, even though that life meant permanent separation from her mother and from her human family, and from the future she might have had if she had made different choices when given the opportunity to walk away from Edward and from the supernatural world he represented. The weight of knowing that the wedding was funeral for Bella Swan, the human created melancholy that Bella tried to hide from everyone because she did not want to diminish their happiness or make them question whether she truly wanted transformation, or whether she was sacrificing herself for Edward's sake rather than choosing immortality, because she genuinely wanted to spend eternity with him and with his family, who had become her family, and who would be her only family. Once transformation severed her connections to the human world and to the people who had known her as mortal girl, who blushed and who stumbled, and who was fragile in ways that vampire Bella would never be fragile again. Rosalie Hale's unexpected softening toward Bella during the wedding preparations surprised everyone who knew their history of antagonism and mutual resentment. Her decision to lend Bella her hairpiece for the wedding, representing peace offering and representing acceptance, that Bella's transformation was inevitable, and that Rosalie's opposition had been futile and had been motivated more by her own grief about her stolen humanity than by any rational argument about whether Bella's choice was wise or foolish. The hairpiece was silver and was beautiful and had been Rosalie's own possession from her human life in Rochester in the 1930s. One of the few items she had kept from the life that had been destroyed by Royce King and his friends in the street, where they had beaten her and violated her and left her dying before Carlyle had found her and had transformed her into vampire whose beauty was magnified but whose humanity was gone forever. Lending the hairpiece to Bella was symbolic and was generous. Rosalie's recognition that Bella deserved beauty on her wedding day, and that some traditions connected women across time and across the boundary between mortality and immortality, creating moments of grace that transcended their differences and their disagreements about the value of human life versus vampire existence. Helping with Bella's hair and makeup on the wedding day gave Rosalie opportunity to observe Bella closely and to see the determination and the certainty in her expression when she looked in the mirror and saw herself transformed into bride who would soon be transformed into vampire. The realization that Bella genuinely wanted transformation and was not being coerced or manipulated by Edward's century of experience and supernatural attraction complicated Rosalie's feelings and made her respect Bella, even while disagreeing with her choice. The recognition that different people valued different things and that Bella's priorities were not wrong simply because they differed from Rosalie's priorities, creating foundation for the friendship that would develop after transformation and after Renesmee's birth, when former enemies would become allies and would become sisters, through shared love for the impossible child who gave Rosalie the motherhood she had mourned since 1933. The ceremony itself, on the 13th of August in 2006, unfolded exactly as Alice had foreseen in her visions, the clouds parting at the precise moment when Bella began her walk down the aisle, and the light filtering through the trees, creating golden glow that made her appear ethereal and made Edward's expression transform from controlled terror into something approaching wonder when he saw her in the wedding dress that had been designed to make her beautiful without competing with her natural grace and without making her appear like someone she was not. Edward's controlled terror throughout the entire ceremony was invisible to human guests who saw only the handsome groom waiting for his bride. But every vampire present could hear his heart that did not beat and could smell the venom pooling in his mouth as he fought instincts that screamed danger at the prospect of what would come after the ceremony, when he would finally consummate the marriage and would finally touch Bella with the fullness of his desire, rather than with the careful control that had characterized their entire relationship. The moment Edward saw Bella in her dress created a cascade of emotions that his gift for reading minds made even more complex, because he could hear the thoughts of everyone watching and could hear their admiration and their envy and their joy and their skepticism about whether marriage between 18-year-old girl and her mysterious boyfriend would last beyond the honeymoon phase that characterized most teenage romances. His overwhelming guilt about what he was taking her toward made him want to stop the ceremony and to tell her to run and to save herself from the transformation that would steal her humanity and would steal her soul if souls existed, and if vampires had lost theirs when venom replaced their blood and stopped their hearts and made them immortal predators designed to hunt humans rather than to love them. But Bella's expression as she walked toward him showed no hesitation and no doubt, her eyes fixed on his face with certainty that made his objections seem paternalistic and seem insulting to her ability to choose her own future and to accept consequences of choices she had made with full knowledge of what she was gaining and what she was losing. The vows they spoke were traditional and were simple, neither of them wanting elaborate personal statements that would seem performative or would reveal too much about the supernatural nature of their relationship to human guests who believed this was normal wedding between normal young people who had fallen in love in normal way. Edward's voice when he said "I do" carried weight of his century of existence and weight of his knowledge that he was binding Bella to him forever, and that forever meant something different to vampires than it meant to humans who spoke the same words, while secretly acknowledging that divorce was possible, and that forever often ended when circumstances changed, or when love faded, or when people grew apart. For vampires, marriage was eternal commitment that would persist across centuries and across continents and across all the changes that time would bring. The bond strengthened by transformation and by the mate connection that would make separation painful and would make betrayal impossible for those who truly loved each other rather than simply being attracted or being compatible. The reception that followed the ceremony created unprecedented situation where humans and vampires mingled in close proximity for hours while eating food and drinking champagne and dancing and celebrating union between species that should have been impossible and that would have been forbidden if the Volturi had known about it before Bella's transformation made her vampire and made her legal in vampire society that did not recognize human vampire marriages as legitimate or as permanent. Jasper Whitlock spent the entire reception using his empathic gift to manipulate emotions and to suppress the bloodlust that every vampire felt when surrounded by so many humans whose scents filled the air and whose heartbeats created symphony of temptation that required constant vigilance and constant control to resist. His exhaustion by the end of the night was profound and was physical despite vampires not experiencing fatigue in the way humans experienced it, his gift draining something from him that was not physical energy but was mental and emotional capacity to maintain so many emotional manipulations simultaneously for so many hours without rest or without relief. The human guests noticed nothing unusual beyond the Cullens' extraordinary beauty and their perfect coordination and their slightly odd behavior that seemed like rich people, eccentricity rather than seeming like predatory nature, barely controlled through decades of practice and through philosophical commitment to vegetarian lifestyle that went against every instinct vampire nature provided. The toasts revealed character dynamics and revealed social hierarchies. Emmett Cullen's humorous speech about Edward finally finding someone who could tolerate his brooding making, everyone laughed, while subtly acknowledging the dark intensity that Edward brought to the relationship and that Bella seemed to accept, and even to appreciate, despite how it might have frightened away someone less determined or less in love. Jessica Stanley's toast, on behalf of Bella's human friends, carried undertones of jealousy and carried resentment about Bella's social ascension through marriage to wealthy family that would take her away from Forks and away from the ordinary life that Jessica and the other human girls would live, while Bella became something else entirely. The food that had been prepared for the human guests was elaborate and was expensive. Alice's planning ensuring that every detail was perfect, even though no vampire would eat any of it, and even though the entire culinary experience was wasted on beings who could not taste food and could not digest it and could only pretend to consume it through careful staging and through strategic disposal when no one was watching. The Cullens' pretense of eating required them to visit the bathroom frequently to dispose of food they had placed in their mouths but could not swallow. The performance exhausting and humiliating but necessary to maintain their cover and to prevent human guests from noticing that something was fundamentally wrong with family that never seemed to eat despite being present at meal after meal and celebration after celebration. Jacob Black's arrival during the reception created tension that rippled through the vampire guests who could smell werewolf approaching long before human guests noticed his presence. His decision to attend representing victory over his grief and representing his genuine love for Bella that transcended his hatred of vampires and his disgust at what she was choosing to become through transformation that would occur after the honeymoon, that Jacob had not known would include consummation until Bella told him during their dance in the garden, where she had gone to greet him and to thank him for coming, despite how painful it must have been to watch her marry Edward. The conversation between Bella and Jacob during their dance moved from gentle reminiscence to horror when Bella mentioned the honeymoon plans and Jacob realized that Edward intended to consummate the marriage, while Bella was still human and still fragile, and still capable of being killed by vampire strength that Edward might not be able to control in the heat of passion that neither of them had fully experienced before. Jacob's reaction was visceral and was violent, his body beginning the transformation into werewolf form, before he caught himself and forced his human shape to remain, despite his rage at Edward, for planning to risk Bella's life and despite his fury at Bella, for agreeing to something so dangerous and so unnecessary when she could have waited until after transformation, when her vampire body would be durable enough to withstand anything Edward could do to her. Edward's hearing of Jacob's thoughts made him aware of the confrontation before Jacob's raised voice brought Seth Clearwater and the other young werewolves running to intervene and to prevent Jacob from phasing a wedding full of humans who would be traumatized and who would ask questions that could never be answered without revealing the supernatural world that existed beneath Fork's peaceful surface. Sam Yuli's pack orders had been clear about maintaining the treaty and maintaining the secret. Jacob's near violation of both creating crisis that required immediate removal from the reception before his presence caused disaster that would affect both vampires and werewolves. The real reason Jacob left the wedding had less to do with protecting the secret and more to do with his own heartbreak becoming unbearable when confronted with the reality of Bella's choice and the finality of her marriage, and the knowledge that she would soon be vampire who could never return to him and could never choose the life they might have had together if she had been willing to accept his love instead of choosing Edward's cold immortality. His departure was abrupt and was painful for Bella, who watched him go and who knew that this might be the last time she saw him, before transformation changed her into something he would hate and something he would be obligated to destroy if treaty terms required werewolves to kill vampires who threatened human life or who violated boundaries that protected the Quileute reservation from vampire incursion. Isle Esme existed as Carlisle Cullen's gift to his wife Esme, the private island off the coast of Brazil, representing his love and representing his desire to give her places where they could exist without pretense and without the constant performance required by living among humans who could never know what they truly were. The island had been purchased decades earlier, when Carlisle's medical career had generated sufficient wealth to afford such extravagance, and when his desire to provide Esme with sanctuary had overcome his general frugality and his tendency to view wealth as tool rather than as end in itself. The house on the island had been designed specifically for vampire comfort rather than for human visitors. The lack of mirrors and the abundance of space and the opening architecture that allowed for quick movement and for privacy, creating an environment where vampires could relax and could be themselves without fear of exposure, or without need to moderate their speed or their strength or their other abilities that would seem supernatural and would seem impossible to any human observer. Previous visits to Isle Esme by various family members had created history and had created associations. Emmett and Rosalie's multiple honeymoons there, making the island synonymous with vampire passion and vampire celebration of bonds that were eternal and were absolute. Alice and Jasper had spent time there as well, their visit creating memories that Alice cherished and that she had shared with Bella through enthusiastic descriptions of the island's beauty and the ocean's warmth and the perfect isolation that made the location ideal for honeymoon, that would include vampire-human intimacy that had never been attempted before and that carried risks no one could fully predict or fully prepare for. Edward's wedding night terror was culmination of century of planning and century of imagining and century of fearing this exact moment when he would finally be alone with Bella and would finally be permitted to touch her without restraint and without the artificial boundaries that had protected her from his strength and from his desire throughout their relationship. His elaborate precautions included careful feeding before the wedding to ensure his thirst was minimal, his mental preparation through meditation and through visualization of control techniques he had developed over decades, and his physical preparations including having extra pillows available for biting when the urge to bite Bella became overwhelming and needed outlet that would not result in her death or her transformation, before she had explicitly consented to venom entering her bloodstream and changing her forever. The specific control techniques Edward employed during their first time together required him to maintain constant awareness of his strength and his teeth, and his position relative to Bella's fragile human body that could break so easily under vampire force that was designed to destroy rather than to caress. Biting down on pillows prevented him from biting Bella's neck or her shoulder or any other body part that his instincts screamed to bite when passion and bloodlust combined into overwhelming urge that was simultaneously sexual and predatory in ways that made vampire intimacy fundamentally different from human intimacy that did not carry risk of death with every touch and every kiss. His moment-by-moment internal battle between desire and danger created experience that was ecstatic and was terrifying simultaneously. His awareness that he could kill her accidentally, making every second feel like standing on edge of cliff, where one wrong move would result in catastrophic fall. The morning after discovery brought Edward's horror at what he had done crashing through whatever satisfaction or relief he might have felt at successfully consummating their marriage without killing her. The bruises covering Bella's body and the feather stuffing scattered across the destroyed bedroom, providing evidence that his control had been imperfect and that his strength had exceeded what human body could endure without damage, even when that damage was minor compared to what could have happened if he had truly lost control. The destruction included pillows torn to shreds by his teeth, the headboard cracked from his grip, and various other signs of violence that would have terrified anyone who understood what they represented and what they revealed about the danger Bella had been in and continued to be in every time Edward touched her, with anything approaching genuine passion rather than with the careful gentleness that made intimacy feel clinical and made pleasure feel dangerous. Edward's immediate vow to never touch Bella again represented his overreaction and represented his guilt, overwhelming his reason, his conviction that he was monster who had hurt his wife, making him determined to protect her from himself, even if that protection meant denying both of them the physical intimacy that married couples were supposed to enjoy, and that Bella desperately wanted, despite the risks and despite the bruises that she considered minor inconveniences, rather than considering them evidence of danger. Bella's frustration at his overreaction created conflict that dominated the rest of their honeymoon. Her various attempts at seduction meeting his absolute refusal and his determination to keep distance between them, that felt like punishment and felt like rejection, even though his motivations came from love and came from terror of hurting her more seriously than bruises, and came from his century of believing that he was damn creature who destroyed everything he touched. The first signs of pregnancy appeared approximately 2 weeks into the honeymoon, when Bella's period failed to arrive on schedule, and when her body began exhibiting symptoms that she initially dismissed as stress or as adjustment to the intensity of their physical relationship. After Edward had finally agreed to make love to her a second time, following days of negotiation and persuasion that had worn down his resistance and had convinced him that she could survive his passion if he maintained better control and if he focused on her pleasure rather than on his fear. Her late period alone would not have alarmed her because stress and travel and emotional intensity could all disrupt menstrual cycles in ways that were normal and were temporary. But the combination of missed period with sudden food aversions and with vivid dreams that felt qualitatively different from her normal dreams created pattern that suggested something was happening inside her body that exceeded normal physiological responses to honeymoon activities. The vivid dreams that accompanied early pregnancy were not typical pregnancy dreams about babies or about motherhood, but were strange sensory experiences where she felt awareness beyond her own consciousness, presence inside her that seemed separate and seemed intentional in ways that made her wonder whether she was losing her mind or whether something impossible was occurring inside her womb, where human egg and vampire sperm should never have been able to create viable embryo because vampire bodies were frozen and were dead, and were incapable of biological processes that required living cells and functioning systems. Her change in appetite manifested as sudden revulsion toward foods she normally enjoyed, and sudden craving for raw meat and for rare steak that she wanted so undercooked it was nearly bleeding. The change disturbing Edward when he noticed, and concerning Bella when she recognized that her body was demanding things that human pregnancy would not typically demand so early in gestation. The moment she connected the symptoms to pregnancy possibility was a moment of pure terror, followed by a moment of pure wonder. Her intellectual understanding that vampire human conception was impossible warring with her physical awareness that something was growing inside her, and that something was alive and was developing in ways that could not be explained through normal biology or normal reproductive science. She stood in the bathroom of the Isle Esme house, holding her hands over her still flat stomach, and feeling the certainty that she was carrying Edward's child, despite every law of vampire nature declaring this could not happen, and despite her own knowledge that vampires were sterile and were incapable of creating life when their own bodies were sustained by venom rather than by blood, and were frozen at the moment of transformation rather than continuing biological processes that characterized living organisms. The phone call to Carlisle Cullen was made from bathroom, where Bella locked herself away from Edward, who was hunting on the mainland and who would not return for several hours, her terror at telling Edward about the pregnancy making her seek medical confirmation before confronting her husband, whose reaction she could predict with absolute certainty would be horror and would be immediate demand for abortion to save her life. Carlisle answered on the second ring and listened to her halting explanation of symptoms with growing shock that she could hear in his silence and in his sharp intake of breath. When she mentioned the missed period and the food aversions and the sense of presence inside her that felt like separate consciousness, rather than feeling like her own thoughts or her own awareness. Carlisle's medical shock at the impossibility of what Bella was describing manifested in his uncharacteristic loss of composure and in his immediate series of questions about dates and about symptoms and about whether she had taken pregnancy test or had any other confirmation beyond her subjective sense that something was wrong or different or changing inside her body. His centuries of medical knowledge and his extensive study of vampire biology had never included any documentation of vampire-human hybrid pregnancy because such thing was believed to be impossible and was believed to be prevented by the fundamental incompatibility between living human reproductive cells and dead vampire cells that should not have been capable of fertilization or of cell division or of any other process required for embryonic development. His immediate concern for Bella's safety overrode his scientific fascination with the impossibility she was describing. His medical training making him recognize that pregnancy complicated by supernatural elements could be dangerous in ways that normal pregnancy was not dangerous, and could threaten Bella's life in ways that would require immediate intervention and immediate return to Forks, where he could monitor her condition and could provide medical care if complications developed. The decision to return immediately to Forks was made without consulting Edward, because both Bella and Carlisle understood that Edward would react with panic and would potentially refuse to return to a place where abortion would be easily accessible through Carlisle's medical equipment and through his surgical expertise that could end the pregnancy before it progressed to a point where termination became more dangerous or more complicated. The flight home was scheduled for the next day. Carlisle's careful planning, ensuring that they could return without arousing Edward's immediate suspicion and without creating scene that would reveal the pregnancy before Bella was ready to confront Edward's reaction and before she had decided how to respond to his inevitable demand that she terminate the pregnancy to save her own life. Edward's discovery of the pregnancy happened when he overheard Bella's phone conversation with Carlisle, discussing logistics of their return to Forks, his vampire hearing making privacy impossible even when Bella tried to whisper or tried to speak quietly enough that normal human hearing would not detect her words. His immediate conviction that the fetus was killing her manifested in his expression and in his body language long before he spoke, his face transforming from curiosity about why she was on the phone into horror when he understood what she was saying, and into determination when he realized that she was planning to return to Forks, where Carlisle could provide medical care. His mental shift from husband to protector willing to do anything to save her life happened instantaneously and happened completely. His love for Bella overriding any consideration of the potential life growing inside her and overriding any possibility that she might want to continue the pregnancy rather than terminate it immediately to preserve her own survival. The flight home was tense and was silent. Edward's rage at himself for causing the pregnancy and his terror about Bella's survival making conversation impossible when every word felt inadequate and every attempt at discussion devolved into argument about whether the fetus deserved protection or deserved destruction. Bella's realization that Edward would want abortion became certainty during the flight when she watched his expression and heard his muttered comments about monsters and about things that should not exist, and about his responsibility to save her from the consequences of his moment of weakness, when he had agreed to consummate their marriage, despite knowing that his frozen body might still retain some capacity for reproduction, even though such capacity was believed to be impossible and was believed to be eliminated by transformation process that stopped all biological functions and replaced them with supernatural alternatives. Carlisle's medical assessment upon their arrival at the Cullen house confirmed the pregnancy through physical examination and through ultrasound that showed fetus that was approximately 4 weeks developed despite being only 1 week since conception could have occurred. The accelerated growth rate creating immediate concern about how long the pregnancy would last and how large the fetus would become before birth became necessary or became inevitable. Normal ultrasound technology could not penetrate the amniotic sac that contained venom in addition to amniotic fluid. The vampire contribution to the pregnancy making the fetus protected by substance that was harder than normal tissue, and that was designed to preserve and to protect vampire cells rather than human cells. His estimation of growth rate suggested that full term would be reached in approximately 1 month, rather than in 9 months that characterize human pregnancy. The acceleration creating urgency and creating danger, because Bella's human body was not designed to accommodate such rapid fetal development, and was not designed to provide nutrition and support for hybrid creature that was part vampire and needed blood and needed resources that human mother could not easily provide. The biology of impossibility fascinated Carlyle, even as it terrified him. His scientific mind trying to understand how vampire-human pregnancy could occur when vampire bodies were believed to be completely sterile and completely incapable of reproduction through normal biological means. The specific conditions that allowed Edward to father child appeared to involve male vampire fertility being preserved through transformation in ways that female vampire fertility was not preserved. The frozen but viable sperm theory suggesting that male reproductive cells were somehow protected by venom and were somehow capable of fertilizing human egg, despite being technically dead, and despite lacking the biological machinery that living sperm required for motility and for penetration of egg membrane. Female vampires like Rosalie could never conceive because their eggs were frozen at transformation and were incapable of being fertilized, or of dividing, or of implanting in uterine wall that no longer functioned and no longer could support pregnancy. The gender difference in vampire fertility, creating tragic irony, where male vampires could father children with human women, while female vampires could never become mothers regardless of how desperately they wanted children. The family division began the moment Carlyle finished his examination and gathered everyone to explain the situation. Edward's immediate demand for abortion meeting Rosalie's instant protective stance toward the fetus that she had not seen and had not met, but already viewed as precious life that deserved protection and deserved chance to exist, despite the danger it posed to Bella, and despite the impossibility of its conception. Rosalie's reaction was visceral and was immediate. Her 7 decades of grief about her own inability to have children making her fierce defender of any pregnancy and any potential life, even when that life threatened someone else, and even when protecting that life meant opposing family members whose positions she normally respected and whose opinions she normally valued. Carlyle's medical neutrality was challenged by his personal relationships with both Edward and Bella, his obligation as doctor to present options and to respect patient autonomy, warring with his role as father figure who wanted to protect his family from harm and from decisions that might result in tragedy that could be prevented through medical intervention. Esme's torn position between supporting Edward and supporting Bella's right to choose created internal conflict that manifested in her silence and in her withdrawal from family discussions, where taking sides felt like betrayal regardless of which position she supported. Alice's inability to see Bella's future once the pregnancy began created frustration and created anxiety because her gift had always provided warning about dangers and had always allowed family to prepare for threats. The blind spot that pregnancy created, making everyone feel vulnerable and making decisions more difficult when normal advantage of precognition was unavailable. Jasper's tactical assessment of the situation focused on practical concerns about Bella's survival and about the potential threat that hybrid child might pose if it survived birth and proved to be dangerous or proved to be uncontrollable in ways that could threaten the family's security or could threaten the secrecy that protected all vampires from human discovery. The physical breakdown of Bella's body during the pregnancy weeks followed trajectory that horrified everyone who witnessed it, and that created urgency about whether intervention could save her life or whether the pregnancy would complete its course regardless of medical attempts to slow or stop the destruction occurring inside her. The week-by-week progression revealed fetus that was growing at approximately 7 times normal human rate, each day bringing changes that should have taken week in normal pregnancy, and each week bringing development that should have taken month or longer when human fetus developed according to biological timeline that allowed mother's body to adjust and to accommodate the increasing size and increasing demands of growing child. The first rib fracture occurred during the 2nd week, when the fetus was approximately 8 weeks developed and was large enough that its movements inside Bella's womb created pressure against her internal organs and created stress on her skeletal structure that was not designed to expand as rapidly as vampire-human hybrid required for its accelerated growth. The sound of Bella's ribs cracking was audible to everyone with vampire hearing in the house. The sharp snap followed by Bella's gasp of pain, creating moments of horror that made even Rosalie question whether continuing the pregnancy was murder rather than protection, and whether her own desperate need for vicarious motherhood was blinding her to the reality that Bella was dying in slow motion, and that the baby she was protecting was killing its mother through its very existence. Carlisle's medical examination after the first rib fracture revealed that the break was clean, but was painful, and was likely to be followed by additional fractures as the fetus continued to grow and continued to press outward against Bella's increasingly fragile skeletal structure that was being depleted of calcium and of other minerals to support the hybrid's bone development. His prescription of pain medication was complicated by Bella's refusal to take anything that might affect the baby, and by his uncertainty about whether normal pain medications would work on pregnancy that was anything but normal, and that involved fetus with vampire characteristics that might make it resistant to human pharmaceuticals. Her inability to keep down human food manifested early in the 3rd week, when her body rejected everything she ate within minutes of consumption. The nausea and vomiting so severe that she could not maintain nutrition through normal dietary means, and began losing weight despite being pregnant and despite needing additional calories to support the rapidly developing fetus that was consuming her from inside. The weight loss was dramatic and was visible, her face becoming gaunt and her body becoming skeletal as the pregnancy progressed, and as the fetus took everything it needed from her tissues and from her organs and from her bones that were breaking down to provide calcium and other minerals required for hybrid development. Her cheekbones became prominent and her eyes became sunken, the transformation making her appear like concentration camp victim or like terminal cancer patient whose body was being consumed by disease that could not be stopped and could not be slowed through any medical intervention currently available. Internal bleeding began in the 3rd week, when the placenta invaded too deeply into her uterine wall and when blood vessels ruptured under the strain of supporting fetus that was larger and more demanding than human placenta was designed to accommodate. The blood loss creating anemia and creating weakness that made Bella unable to stand without assistance and unable to remain conscious for extended periods without her body shutting down to conserve energy. Carlisle's attempts to manage the internal bleeding through medication and through careful monitoring were limited by his inability to perform invasive procedures without risking harm to the fetus, and without triggering Rosalie's protective response that would prevent him from approaching Bella with surgical instruments or with any tools that might be used to terminate the pregnancy. The blood pooling in Bella's abdomen created additional pressure and created additional pain that she endured without complaint, because complaining would give Edward ammunition for his arguments that the pregnancy needed to end, and that her suffering proved the fetus was monster rather than child. The bruising that covered Bella's entire body appeared wherever the fetus moved or pressed against her internal structures. The vampire strength inherited from Edward, making the baby capable of damaging its mother through ordinary movements that would not have harmed human mother carrying human baby, whose strength was appropriate for gestational age and whose size was appropriate for human womb. The bruises were deep purple and were extensive, covering her abdomen and her sides and her back, where the fetus pressed outward and where her skin stretched beyond what human skin was designed to stretch, without tearing or without permanent damage that would remain even after pregnancy ended through birth or through death. Edward's horror at seeing the bruises that covered Bella's body was compounded by his knowledge that he had caused this through his moment of weakness on their honeymoon, and through his decision to give Bella what she wanted, despite knowing that consequences could be catastrophic and could include her death through pregnancy complications that no human doctor would recognize and that no vampire had ever witnessed. The blood solution emerged from Jacob Black's disgusted observation that the fetus was probably craving blood rather than craving human food. His comment made in anger and in horror at what he was witnessing becoming the key insight that allowed Bella to maintain some nutrition when human food continued to be rejected immediately upon consumption. His suggestion was meant as insult and was meant to emphasize the monstrous nature of the thing growing inside Bella. But Carlyle recognized immediately that Jacob might be correct, and that hybrid fetus with vampire characteristics might need blood to support its development in ways that human fetus would not need blood, beyond what mother's circulatory system provided through placental exchange. Bella's initial revulsion at drinking blood was overcome by her desperation to provide for the baby, and by her recognition that the hybrid nature meant normal human nutrition was insufficient for a creature that was part vampire and needed vampire sustenance to support its development and to prevent it from consuming her body entirely in its attempt to find nutrients that human food could not provide. Carlyle's preparation of blood for consumption involved procuring human blood from blood banks through his hospital connections and through his medical license that allowed him access to blood supplies that were designated for transfusions but could be diverted for this unprecedented medical situation that no ethics committee would ever approve if they knew the truth about what was happening inside the Cullen house. The preparation involved warming the blood to body temperature to make it more palatable and to make it easier for Bella to consume without gagging or without her body rejecting it, as it had rejected all other forms of nutrition throughout the third week. The specific type of blood mattered less than the fact that it was human blood rather than animal blood. The fetus, apparently able to detect the difference and apparently preferring human blood in ways that confirmed Edward's worst fears about the creature's nature and about its potential danger if it survived birth, and if it proved to have vampire appetites combined with vampire strength, but without vampire control or without vampire awareness of the need for secrecy. Why blood worked when food did not relate it to the fetus being part vampire and needing the specific proteins and the specific nutrients that blood contained and that human food did not contain, insufficient quantities or inappropriate forms for vampire biology to process and to use for growth and for development. The amino acids in blood were more bioavailable and were more concentrated than amino acids from cooked meat or from plant sources. The difference significant enough that fetus could extract what it needed from blood while being unable to extract sufficient nutrition from normal food that human digestive system could process, but that vampire-influenced fetus could not utilize effectively. Edward, having to smell blood constantly while maintaining control, created additional torture for him beyond his terror about Bella's survival. His thirst triggered repeatedly throughout each day when blood was prepared and when Bella consumed it, and when the scent lingered in the house, despite attempts to ventilate and to clean and to minimize the olfactory assault that made every vampire in the house struggle with control and made feeding times particularly dangerous for Bella, who was surrounded by predators whose instincts screamed to drink from her when her own blood smelled so appealing, and when the prepared blood created additional temptation. His control held through decades of practice and through his absolute commitment to Bella's survival that made his own thirst irrelevant compared to her need for nutrition that might keep her alive long enough to deliver the baby if delivery became inevitable before abortion could be performed, or before Bella changed her mind about continuing the pregnancy that was destroying her. His positioning during Bella's feeding times placed him at maximum distance from the blood while still remaining in the house, his presence necessary for monitoring her condition, but his proximity dangerous when thirst and fear combined to create volatile emotional state that made control more difficult and made mistakes more likely. Rosalie's total devotion to protecting Bella and the pregnancy transformed her from occasional antagonist into constant presence and fierce guardian, who positioned herself physically between Bella and anyone who might attempt to force abortion or might attempt to harm the fetus that Rosalie had claimed as worth protecting regardless of the cost to Bella or to family unity. Her transformation into bodyguard and nurse was complete and was consuming. Her every moment focused on Bella's comfort and on the baby's welfare in ways that revealed the depth of her 7 decades of grief about her own inability to have children, and revealed her desperate need to experience motherhood even vicariously through protecting pregnancy that was not hers, but that represented possibility she had believed was forever closed to all vampires. Her physical positioning near Bella at all times made abortion impossible, without physically removing Rosalie first, her vampire strength and her vampire speed, making her formidable obstacle to anyone who tried to approach Bella with medical instruments or with intentions to end the pregnancy against Bella's stated wishes. Her gentleness with Bella, despite her usual coldness, and despite her general preference for maintaining emotional distance, surprised everyone who witnessed the care she provided and the soft tone she used when speaking to Bella about the baby and about the future they might have if both survived the delivery that was approaching with terrifying speed. The bond forming between former enemies was genuine and was based on shared commitment to protecting the pregnancy, despite opposition from family members who believed abortion was necessary and was justified by medical necessity that outweighed fetal rights or maternal autonomy, when continuing pregnancy meant certain death for mother and uncertain survival for baby. Rosalie's preparation of blood for Bella's consumption became ritual that was performed with tenderness and with care. Her handling of each cup of blood as if it were precious medicine that would save both mother and child if administered correctly and if consumed in sufficient quantities. Edward's psychological breakdown manifested in his inability to function normally and in his obsessive focus on finding a solution that would save Bella, while eliminating the threat he perceived the fetus represented to her: survival. Hearing the baby's thoughts through his gift for reading minds created horror that exceeded even his fear about Bella's physical deterioration. His descriptions of what he heard from the fetus being vague and being disturbing when he told Jacob that the thing inside Bella was aware and was intelligent and was satisfied with its current situation despite the damage it was causing to its mother. His characterization of the fetus as a monster to Jacob during conversation about potential solutions revealed his inability to see the pregnancy as anything other than parasitic invasion that needed to be destroyed before it completed its destruction of Bella's body and before it killed her through the birth process that would inevitably involve massive trauma and massive blood loss that her weakened body could not survive. His inability to sleep or to hunt properly created additional deterioration in his condition, and in his judgment, his normally careful reasoning compromised by terror and by sleep deprivation that affected vampires differently than it affected humans, but still created impairment when consciousness was maintained for weeks without the brief periods of rest that even vampires sometimes require to process experiences and to maintain mental clarity. The spine break happened suddenly on the 10th of September in 2006 when Bella was standing in the living room attempting to walk from the couch to the bathroom with Rosalie's assistance, and when the baby's movement inside her womb was more forceful than previous movements had been and created pressure against her lumbar vertebrae that exceeded what her weakened skeletal structure could withstand without catastrophic failure. The sound was audible to everyone in the house, despite attempts at conversation and despite background noise. The crack resonating through the space like gunshot and being followed immediately by Bella's collapse as her legs stopped functioning and as her body folded in ways that bodies should not fold when spinal cord is severed, and when signals from brain can no longer reach lower extremities that become dead weight rather than remaining functional limbs. The immediate paralysis terrified Bella more than the pain terrified her, because inability to feel her legs meant damage that might be permanent and meant injury that could kill her through complications, even if the baby was delivered successfully, and even if transformation occurred quickly enough to heal the damage before it became irreversible. Bella's terror of not feeling her legs manifested in her screams and in her attempts to move limbs that no longer responded to her mental commands, her hands reaching down to touch her thighs and her calves and her feet that felt foreign and felt disconnected from her body in ways that created panic beyond what pain alone could create. Edward's realization that birth had to happen immediately came from his medical knowledge gained through decades of watching Carlisle work, and from his understanding that paralysis meant the baby had damaged something critical, and that waiting any longer would result in Bella's death before delivery could occur, and before transformation could begin. The healing process that might save her life if venom was introduced quickly enough, and if her heart continued beating long enough. For venom to circulate and to reach all the damaged tissues that needed repair. The emergency nature of the delivery created chaos as everyone moved into position and as Carlyle prepared for surgical procedure that would need to happen faster than normal cesarean section could happen, because Bella's condition was deteriorating by the second, and because her heartbeat was becoming irregular in ways that suggested cardiac arrest was imminent if stress and shock and blood loss continued without intervention. Rosalie positioned herself near Bella's head where she could provide comfort and could hold Bella's hand and could avoid the blood that would soon fill the room when incisions were made and when the baby was extracted from the womb that could no longer safely contain it. Edward positioned himself at Bella's side where he could perform the delivery if Carlyle's hands proved insufficient, and where he could inject the venom immediately if Bella's heart stopped before the baby was free. The failed caesarean section attempt happened when Carlyle used scalpel to cut into Bella's abdomen and discovered that the blade could not penetrate the amniotic sac that surrounded the fetus and that protected it with substance that was harder than human tissue and that was reinforced with something that made it impervious to surgical steel that should have cut through membrane easily, but that instead skidded across the surface without creating incision that would allow access to the baby inside. Why surgical tools did not work related to the amniotic sac being tougher than anything Carlyle had encountered in his centuries of medical practice. The vampire contribution to the pregnancy, apparently creating protective barrier that was designed to survive vampire strength and vampire accidents that might damage normal pregnancy, but that could not damage this hybrid pregnancy that was protected by biology that exceeded human biology in durability and in resistance to trauma. The discovery that only vampire teeth could penetrate the amniotic sac came when Carlyle abandoned the scalpel after multiple failed attempts and used his teeth to bite carefully into Bella's abdomen and to tear through the layers of tissue and through the protective sac that surrounded the baby, whose movements were becoming more frantic and whose distress was apparent even without medical monitoring, that would have shown fetal heart rate climbing and would have shown signs of oxygen deprivation that occurred when placenta began to separate prematurely and when blood flow to the fetus was compromised. Jacob's horror at watching vampires bite into Bella was visible in his expression and was audible in his sharp intake of breath. His instinctive revulsion at seeing his friend being consumed by the creatures he hated, warring with his recognition that this was medical procedure rather than being attack, and that Edward and Carlyle were trying to save her rather than trying to kill her. Rosalie's loss of control at the blood smell happened instantaneously when Bella's blood filled the room in the quantities that exceeded anything Rosalie had been exposed to during her decades of vegetarian practice. The scent triggering thirst that overrode her conscious control and that made her lunge toward Bella with intent to drink that was biological and was undeniable despite her love for Bella and despite her commitment to protecting the pregnancy and the mother who carried it. The moment was brief, but was terrifying. Rosalie's expression transforming from concern into predatory focus and her body moving with vampire speed toward Bella's bleeding abdomen before Jacob and Edward could intervene and could restrain her and could remove her from the delivery room before she could hurt Bella or could drink from her or could create additional trauma beyond what the delivery itself was creating. Jacob and Edward's forced cooperation to restrain Rosalie and to remove her from the room represented unprecedented alliance between natural enemies who had competed for Bella's affection and who had opposed each other on nearly every issue related to the pregnancy and to Bella's future. Their combined strength sufficient to overcome Rosalie's resistance and to drag her away from Bella despite her struggles and despite her attempts to break free and to return to the blood that called to her instincts in ways that decades of control could not overcome when the scent was so strong and when the quantity was so abundant. The chaos of the delivery room escalated as Emmett took over restraining Rosalie and as Edward returned to Bella's side, where Carlyle was working frantically to extract the baby from the womb that was collapsing and from the protective sac that was finally torn open and was finally allowing access to the infant inside. Renesmee's emergence from Bella's body happened in rush of blood and fluid and tissue, the baby sliding free of the womb and being caught in Carlyle's hands before she could fall or could be damaged by the rough extraction that was necessary to save both mother and child from death. They were seconds away if delivery did not complete immediately. Her immediate eye contact with Bella created moment of connection that transcended the pain and the chaos and the horror of the delivery. The baby's brown eyes focusing on her mother's face with awareness that seemed impossible for newborn, who should have had limited vision and limited consciousness, but who appeared alert and appeared intentional in ways that confirmed Edward's reports that the baby had been aware and had been thinking throughout the pregnancy. Bella's only moment holding her daughter lasted seconds before the baby was torn from her arms by Edward, who needed to clear Bella's airway and needed to begin the transformation process before her heart stopped permanently and before death became irreversible, even with vampire venom coursing through her system. Renesmee's bite of Bella during those brief seconds of contact was accidental and was instinctive. The baby's teeth breaking through Bella's skin and injecting small amount of venom that would help with transformation. But that also created wound that bled and that added to the chaos and to the blood loss that was already critical and was already threatening Bella's survival. The baby being torn from Bella to save Bella's life created maternal anguish that was visible in Bella's expression, even as consciousness began to fade, and even as her body began shutting down from blood loss and from shock, and from the massive trauma that delivery had inflicted on organs and on tissues that were already damaged and were already failing. Her whispered request to let her see the baby again went unheard in the chaos as Edward worked to save her life, and as Carlyle cleaned the baby and assessed her condition and determined that she was breathing and was apparently healthy, despite the traumatic delivery and despite the unusual circumstances of her conception and gestation. Bella's death happened gradually and then suddenly, her heart stopping after several minutes of irregular beating that grew weaker and grew more erratic until the electrical signals that coordinated cardiac muscle contractions ceased entirely, and her chest stopped rising and her pulse disappeared from her neck and from her wrists, where Edward had been monitoring it desperately while biting her in all the necessary locations to ensure venom would spread efficiently through her dying system. Edward's venom injection directly into her heart was last, desperate attempt to restart the organ and to give venom direct access to cardiac tissue that would need to be transformed first if transformation was going to succeed before brain death occurred, and before the damage became too extensive for venom to repair, even with its remarkable healing properties. Jacob's CPR keeping blood flowing through Bella's body was crucial intervention that gave venom time to circulate and time to reach tissues that needed transformation before cellular death became permanent and before revival became impossible, even with supernatural assistance. His compressions on Bella's chest were strong and were rhythmic, his werewolf strength allowing him to maintain the physical effort required for effective CPR for extended period without tiring and without losing the pace that was necessary to keep oxygenated blood moving through her brain and through her organs, while Edward injected venom, and while Carlyle monitored her condition and determined whether the transformation was beginning or whether they were simply delaying inevitable death. The clinical death lasting for several minutes created uncertainty about whether transformation would work or whether the damage was too severe, and whether Bella's human life was ending without the possibility of vampire existence beginning to replace it. Edward's anguished conversation with Bella's body during those minutes revealed his desperation and revealed his grief at having caused her death through his decision to make love to her on their honeymoon, and through his failure to prevent the pregnancy that had destroyed her from inside and had killed her in the end despite everyone's efforts to save her life. Jacob's imprint on Renesmee happened when he entered the room intending to kill the baby who had killed Bella and who represented everything he hated about vampires and about the supernatural world that had destroyed his normal human life and had made him into a werewolf whose existence was defined by fighting monsters. His intention to kill the baby was absolute and was justified in his mind by Bella's death and by his grief that demanded revenge and that demanded someone be held accountable for the loss of the person he loved more than he loved anyone else in the world. The moment he saw Renesmee and made eye contact with her created physical and mental shift that was instantaneous and was complete. The imprint bond forming without his consent and without his desire, but with absolute certainty, that transformed his hatred into devotion and transformed his intention to kill into intention to protect at any cost and through any danger. The physical sensation of imprinting was described by Jacob as feeling like gravity shifted and like the baby became center of his universe, and like everything else became peripheral and became less important than ensuring her safety and ensuring her happiness, regardless of what that required from him or what that cost him in terms of his previous relationships or his previous priorities. His immediate understanding of what had happened came from his knowledge of imprinting through pack history and through stories about other wolves who had imprinted and who had described the experience in ways that matched what Jacob was feeling as he looked at Renesmee and recognized that she was his purpose and was his future regardless of her hybrid nature and regardless of her being the child of vampires he had hated. His new purpose protecting Renesmee meant that Bella's death no longer mattered in the same way and meant that his grief was subordinate to his need to ensure that the baby survived and thrived and grew into whatever she was meant to become with his protection and with his devotion supporting her throughout her life. The transformation of his relationship with the Cullens from enemy to family member happened instantaneously through the imprint. His previous hatred, irrelevant when protecting Renesmee, required him to cooperate with vampires and to live among them and to accept them as his allies rather than as his enemies. The 3 days of fire that consumed Bella's dying body and transformed her dead cells into vampire cells that would sustain her existence indefinitely without requiring heartbeat or requiring breath or requiring any of the biological processes that had maintained her human life, began the moment Edward's venom entered her bloodstream and began spreading through her cardiovascular system toward her heart and toward her brain and toward all the tissues that needed transformation before death became permanent and before revival became impossible even with vampire venom's remarkable regenerative properties. Bella's experience of the burning was more detailed and more conscious than most transformations because her mind remained aware throughout the process despite her body being clinically dead and despite her heart having stopped beating minutes before venom reached cardiac tissue and began the work of reorganizing cells and restructuring organs and creating the supernatural biology that would replace her human biology completely and irreversibly. The pain she experienced during transformation exceeded anything she had felt during the pregnancy or during the delivery. The venom burning through her veins like liquid fire that consumed everything it touched and that left nothing unchanged and that made every second feel like eternity and made every minute feel like hours of torture that had no end and that offered no relief and that could not be escaped through unconsciousness or through death. Because transformation process required consciousness and required awareness to complete the neurological restructuring that would make her vampire mind capable of processing information at supernatural speeds and capable of perfect recall of every moment and every sensation she had ever experienced. The burning was not metaphorical, but was literal sensation as venom broke down human cells and rebuilt them, according to vampire template that had been encoded in Edward's venom through his own transformation a century earlier, and that would be passed to Bella through his bite and through the direct injection into her heart that gave venom access to every part of her body simultaneously. Her supernatural silence during transformation shocked everyone who had witnessed previous transformations and who expected screaming that would last for 3 days, and that would reveal the agony that transformation inflicted on every person who underwent the process of becoming vampire. Bella's silence was not absence of pain, but was extraordinary self-control that she maintained through conscious decision to protect her family from hearing her suffering and to protect Renesmee from being exposed to sounds that might traumatize the infant who was being cared for in nearby room by Rosalie, who had recovered from her loss of control and who had been forgiven because everyone understood that blood loss of that magnitude would have challenged any vampire's control, regardless of their experience or their commitment to vegetarian lifestyle. Why she did not scream related to her awareness that screaming would accomplish nothing except distressing the people she loved, and that silence was gift she could give them even while experiencing agony that exceeded anything she had previously believed was possible for human or vampire to endure. Edward's constant vigil throughout the 3 days of transformation never wavered and never faltered. His position beside her transforming body maintained through every hour and through every minute of the 72 hours that transformation required to complete the process of stopping her heart and rebuilding her tissues and creating the vampire body that would house her consciousness for eternity. His 3 days of terror that transformation would not work came from his knowledge that her injuries had been severe and that her clinical death had lasted longer than was typical for successful transformations, and that the damage to her spine and to her internal organs might be too extensive for venom to repair before permanent death claimed her and removed any possibility of her returning to consciousness in any form. His conversations with her transforming body revealed his guilt about causing the pregnancy through his moment of weakness on Isle Esme, and revealed his grief about all the choices he had made that led to this moment where she was dying or was being reborn, and where he could not know which outcome would prevail until transformation completed, and until she either opened her eyes as vampire or remained forever still as corpse that venom had failed to revive. His preparation for her newborn bloodlust included planning hunting trips that would take them far from human population, and included strategies for managing her thirst during the dangerous first year when control would be difficult and when accidents would be likely, despite best intentions and despite careful supervision by family members who had all survived their own newborn years and who understood the challenges she would face. The family's amazement at her control during transformation extended beyond her silence to include her stillness and her apparent peace, despite the fire burning through her veins and despite the agony that should have made her thrash and should have made her break furniture and should have made her dangerous to anyone nearby who might be injured by her supernatural strength, combined with her lack of conscious control over movements that were driven by pain rather than being driven by intention. The stillness suggested either that her pain was less severe than normal transformation pain, or that her control was more complete than any newborn's control had ever been. The second option, seeming more likely when transformation completed, and when she demonstrated control that defied every expectation and every prediction about how newborn vampires behaved during their first hours and first days of immortal existence. The physical changes occurring throughout transformation were visible to Edward, who watched her face restructure and watched her body heal from the massive trauma that delivery had inflicted, and watched her spine repair itself, and watched her skin become pale and become marble hard in ways that marked her transformation from human to vampire as clearly as red eyes would have marked her if she had been drinking human blood, instead of preparing to adopt the vegetarian lifestyle that Cullen family practiced. Venom repairing her damaged body happened systematically and happened completely. Her shattered spine reconstructing vertebra by vertebra, and her torn uterus healing, and her broken ribs knitting together, and her depleted organs regenerating with supernatural efficiency that exceeded anything human healing could accomplish, even with best medical care, and even with months of recovery time that vampire transformation compressed into 72 hours of continuous cellular reconstruction. Her face restructuring into vampire perfection enhanced the beauty she had possessed as human and magnified it into the supernatural loveliness that characterized all vampires, whose appearance was designed to attract human prey and to overcome human caution through physical beauty that seemed trustworthy and seemed safe despite being predators' lure that drew victims close enough to be killed efficiently and quickly. Her features became more defined and more symmetrical. Her skin became luminous and became flawless. Her lips became fuller and her eyelashes became longer, and her overall appearance became the kind of perfection that humans attempted to achieve through cosmetics and through surgery, but that vampires possessed naturally through transformation that optimized every feature and eliminated every flaw. Her senses sharpening. During transformation, created new awareness of the world that existed beyond human perception. Sounds that human ears could not detect becoming audible, and scents that human noses could not process, becoming distinct, and vision that human eyes could not achieve becoming available through vampire senses that operated at levels that seemed supernatural because they exceeded human baselines by orders of magnitude that made comparison difficult and made the transition from human sensory experience to vampire sensory experience overwhelming for most newborns, who struggled to process the flood of information that their enhanced senses provided constantly and without filter. The moment her heart stopped permanently marked the completion of her physical transformation, even though her consciousness remained dormant for several more hours, while her brain completed its restructuring, and while her vampire mind organized itself and prepared to wake into existence that would feel simultaneously familiar and completely alien. The awakening happened suddenly when Bella's eyes opened and revealed the red irises that marked her as newborn vampire who had consumed human blood during her human life through the blood she had drunk while pregnant, and through the blood that had been present in her system when transformation began. Her first moment of consciousness as vampire brought perfect recall of everything that had happened during delivery and during transformation. Her vampire memory capturing every detail and every sensation with clarity that human memory could never achieve, and that made her fully aware of what had been done to save her life and what had been sacrificed to bring her into immortal existence. Seeing Edward for the first time with vampire eyes created new appreciation for his beauty and created new understanding of why humans found vampires irresistible despite the danger they represented. His features, more perfect and more compelling than human vision had, allowed her to perceive when her senses had been limited by human biology. The intensity of her senses overwhelmed her initially despite her unusual control. The sounds of heartbeats from animals in the forest, and the sense of humans in forks, and the visual detail of every crack in the ceiling and every texture in the fabric covering her body, creating sensory experience that was richer and more complex than anything human existence had provided. Her body felt strong and felt powerful in ways that were completely foreign to her human experience of being fragile and being clumsy and being weak compared to vampires who surrounded her and who had protected her throughout her human life when she had been vulnerable and had been breakable in ways that her vampire body would never be breakable again. First bloodthirst announced itself gradually as burning in her throat that grew from minor discomfort into consuming need that demanded immediate satisfaction and that made hunting necessary before the thirst became unmanageable and before Bella's control faltered and allowed her instincts to override her conscious commitment to vegetarian lifestyle that she had promised to follow. The burning in her throat was different from transformation burning, but was equally demanding and was equally impossible to ignore when it intensified beyond discomfort into actual pain that required feeding and required blood to satisfy the biological need that vampire bodies experience constantly, and that could only be temporarily relieved through consumption of blood from animals or from humans, depending on dietary choices that each vampire made based on their philosophy and their willingness to kill humans for sustenance. Her first hunt with Edward took them deep into the Olympic National Forest, where animal populations were abundant, and where human hikers were rare enough that encounters could be avoided through careful attention to scents and to sounds that would warn of human presence before visual contact occurred. Her encounter with the rock climber happened when she detected human scent that was closer than expected, and when her thirst responded with intensity that nearly overwhelmed her control and that nearly made her attack, despite her conscious intention to resist and to prove that she could maintain vegetarian lifestyle even as newborn whose thirst was stronger and whose control was weaker than established vampire, who had decades or centuries of practice managing their bloodlust. Her choice to resist human blood, despite the overwhelming temptation and despite the burning in her throat that demanded she drink from the human, whose heartbeat she could hear, and whose scent filled her awareness, created moments of triumph that surprised Edward and that defied all predictions about newborn behavior and about newborn capacity for self-control when confronted with readily available human prey. Edward's amazement at her control exceeded his amazement at her silence during transformation, because resisting human blood as newborn was unprecedented in his experience and was unprecedented in the family's collective experience, spanning centuries and spanning dozens of transformations that had all resulted in newborns who required careful supervision and who could not be trusted near humans for months or years until their thirst moderated and until their control developed through practice and through time. Why she had such unusual control remained theoretical, but seemed related to her mental preparation during her human life, and to her mental discipline developed through years of living among vampires, and through her constant awareness of danger, and through her practice at controlling her reactions and her emotions in situations that would have overwhelmed normal humans. Her shield ability that had existed latently during her human life apparently provided additional protection by filtering some of the overwhelming sensory input that made most newborns behave erratically and made them dangerous, because they could not process the flood of information their enhanced senses provided without becoming overstimulated and without losing conscious control over their actions. Meeting Renesmee was Bella's first priority after her initial hunt satisfied her immediate thirst, and after Edward confirmed that her control was sufficient to be near the baby without endangering her through accidental injury or through loss of control triggered by Renesmee's half-human scent that combined human warmth with vampire characteristics in ways that created unique scent profile, unlike anything else in vampire experience. The growth rate mystery that defined Renesmee's first months of life created constant anxiety for the family who watched her develop at pace that suggested she might age 1 year for every month of her existence, and who feared that her rapid development might indicate short lifespan that would make her childhood brief and would make her adult life correspondingly brief if the accelerated aging continued throughout her existence, rather than stabilizing at some point when maturity was reached. Carlyle's documentation and measurements of her growth became daily ritual that provided data about her physical development and that allowed him to track patterns and to make predictions about when her growth might slow and when she might reach the maturity point that would allow her to live for extended period, rather than aging to death within a few years, as some had feared when her development first showed signs of being dramatically faster than human development and dramatically faster than what anyone had anticipated when they first learned of her impossible existence growing inside Bella's dying body. The measurements included height and weight and cognitive assessments that revealed intelligence that was far beyond what her physical age suggested, and that indicated her vampire heritage was contributing mental capabilities that exceeded human childhood development by significant margin, that made her seem more like small adult than like infant or toddler, despite her physical size suggesting she was much younger than her demonstrated comprehension and her demonstrated reasoning abilities indicated. Each measurement was recorded meticulously in Carlyle's journals, along with observations about her behavior and her abilities, and her interactions with family members who were all fascinated by her and all devoted to her in ways that made her the center of the household's attention and the focus of everyone's concern about the future and about whether the Volturi would discover her existence and would interpret her hybrid nature as threat requiring elimination before she could grow into whatever she was destined to become through her unique biology that combined human mortality with vampire immortality in ways no one fully understood. The family's growing concern about her lifespan manifested in quiet conversations when Renesmee was not present, and in careful questions to Carlyle about what his data suggested and whether patterns indicated she would stabilize or would continue aging rapidly until she died of old age while still physically young, and while her vampire family continued existing eternally without any of the natural limitations that mortality imposed on humans and that hybrids might experience despite their partial vampire nature that gave them strength and gave them abilities, but might not give them the indefinite lifespan that full vampires possessed through transformation that stopped aging completely and permanently. Bella's terror that her daughter might have short life was all-consuming. During the first weeks after her transformation, when she was learning to be vampire while simultaneously learning to be mother to child who was changing daily and who was becoming a different person each week, as her development progressed at impossible speed that made each day feel precious and made each milestone feel bittersweet, because it brought her closer to whatever endpoint her accelerated growth was leading toward, whether that endpoint was maturity and stability, or whether that endpoint was death that would claim her while her family watched helplessly. Research into hybrid biology proved frustrating because no documentation existed about vampire-human hybrids in the extensive vampire literature that Carlyle had collected across centuries of study and across his travels to vampire communities throughout the world, where he had sought knowledge about his own nature and about the history of his species and about the variations and the anomalies that occasionally appeared in vampire populations that were generally uniform in their characteristics, but occasionally produced individuals with unusual gifts or unusual abilities that exceeded normal vampire capabilities. The search for information about other hybrids yielded nothing, because hybrid children were so rare that most vampires believed they were impossible, and that male vampire fertility was as non-existent as female vampire fertility, despite evidence to the contrary growing daily in the Cullen household, where Renesmee's existence proved that conception could occur under specific circumstances that remained incompletely understood, even after extensive analysis of what had happened between Edward and Bella on their honeymoon, when biology had defied expectations and had created life where life should have been impossible. Finding nothing in the historical record created despair because it meant Renesmee's future was unknown and unknowable except through observation and through waiting to see whether she would stabilize or would continue aging until her life ended prematurely and tragically, while her vampire family continued existing eternally without her, and without the joy and the purpose that her presence brought to a household that had been stable and had been content, but had not been complete until her impossible birth had given them all someone to love and someone to protect, and someone who represented future in ways that vampires typically could not experience, because their own futures were unchanging repetition, rather than being growth and development and new experiences. The possibility that she might age and die while they remained unchanged was unbearable for Bella, who had just gained her daughter and who could not contemplate losing her to mortality that Bella herself had escaped through transformation, that had saved her life and had given her eternity with Edward and with their family who would endure forever, while human lives flickered briefly and ended, leaving only memories that persisted in vampire minds that forgot nothing and that preserved every moment with perfect clarity across centuries. Renesmee's abilities distinguished her from both humans and vampires and marked her as genuinely new form of life, rather than being simply human with vampire traits or vampire with human traits that created simple combination of characteristics from both species without creating anything fundamentally new or fundamentally different from what already existed. Her gift of thought projection through touch was unique and was powerful, allowing her to share complete memories and complete sensory experiences with anyone she touched by placing her hand on their face or on their hand or on any exposed skin that would allow the transfer of information from her mind into theirs through mechanism that no one understood, but that everyone recognized as extraordinary and as useful for communication, that transcended language barriers and that transcended the limitations of verbal description, that could never fully capture experience or could never fully convey the emotional context that accompanied events and that shaped their meaning. The thought projection was not telepathy, because it was unidirectional and required physical contact, but it was more complete than verbal communication could ever be, because it conveyed emotions and sensations and context that words could not capture, and that normal conversation could not communicate efficiently or completely enough to create true shared understanding. Her intelligence, far beyond her physical age, manifested in vocabulary that expanded rapidly and in understanding of complex concepts that would challenge human adults, and in strategic thinking that suggested she inherited vampire mental capabilities along with vampire physical capabilities that made her stronger and faster than human children, while remaining weaker and slower than vampire children would be if vampire children could exist through transformation that was forbidden and that was prevented by laws that recognized the danger that immortal children represented to vampire secrecy and to vampire survival in a world where humans outnumbered vampires by millions to one. Her ability to understand spoken language developed within days of her birth, and her ability to produce spoken language developed within weeks, her first words coming far earlier than human developmental timelines would predict, and her sentences becoming complex and becoming grammatically correct long before human toddlers typically achieve such linguistic sophistication that required years of practice and years of cognitive development that she compressed into weeks through her accelerated maturation. Her ability to survive on both blood and human food provided flexibility that pure vampires lacked and that pure humans lacked. Her hybrid nature allowing her to consume and to digest normal food, while also deriving nutrition from blood that she preferred, and that seemed to satisfy her more completely than food alone could satisfy her, despite food being adequate for maintaining her health and her growth through the nutrients it provided. Her preference for blood was evident from infancy, when she rejected most solid foods, but accepted blood eagerly and drank it without hesitation or revulsion, despite its taste and its appearance that would disturb most human children who were not raised in vampire household, where blood consumption was normalized and was discussed openly as dietary choice, rather than as monstrous behavior that would horrify humans who associated blood drinking with predation and with death. Her vampire strength, despite small size, manifested in her ability to break objects and to move furniture and to climb structures that would be inaccessible to human children of similar age and size. Her physical capabilities requiring careful supervision and requiring teaching about controlling her strength to avoid accidentally hurting people or accidentally revealing her supernatural nature to humans who might observe her behavior and might become suspicious if they saw small child performing feats that should be impossible for someone with her apparent age and her apparent physical development. Her human warmth and heartbeat distinguished her from vampires whose bodies were cold and whose hearts were still. The combination of warmth and strength creating unique sensory experience when holding her or touching her, because she felt alive in ways vampires did not feel alive, but felt stronger than humans felt when their fragility was evident through their delicate bones and their soft skin that bruised easily and that broke easily under forces that would not even register to vampire bodies that were hard as stone and that were nearly indestructible through normal means. Her venomous bite capability was discovered accidentally when she bit Jacob during play and when her teeth broke his skin and injected venom that burned but did not transform him, because werewolf biology apparently prevented vampire transformation from occurring even when venom entered bloodstream, and even when conditions should have been ideal for transformation to begin its 3-day process of cellular restructuring that would have turned him into vampire if his shapeshifter nature had not provided immunity. The discovery that she had venom was concerning, because it indicated she had vampire traits that could be dangerous and that could potentially kill humans if she bit them accidentally, or if she bit them intentionally during tantrum or during moment of anger that made her forget her strength and made her forget the danger her bite represented to fragile human bodies that could not survive venom injection without transforming into vampires themselves if they survived the initial injection and if their hearts continued beating long enough for venom to spread throughout their systems. Bella's newborn year was characterized by exceptional control that continued to amaze the family and that continued to defy expectations about newborn behavior and about newborn limitations that typically made first year dangerous and made it necessary to isolate new vampires from human contact until their thirst moderated and until their control improved through practice and through time, that allowed them to adjust to their new senses and their new capabilities, that overwhelmed most newborns and made them behave erratically and made them dangerous to humans and to other vampires who might accidentally trigger their hunting instincts. Why she was so different from typical newborns remained topic of discussion and remained subject of theories that ranged from her shield, protecting her from sensory overload, to her mental preparation during human life, to her maternal motivation, providing focus that other newborns lacked because they had not chosen transformation to protect someone they loved, and because they had not spent months preparing mentally for the transition from human to vampire existence that would change everything about how they experienced the world. Her training with the family included hunting practice that took her into the Olympic National Forest, where she learned to track prey and learned to kill efficiently and learned to dispose of remains in ways that would not create evidence of vampire activity that might alert humans to supernatural presence in their territory. The control exercises included exposure to human scent through careful proximity to hiking trails and through visits to town, where she practiced breathing techniques and practiced maintaining composure when surrounded by humans whose blood called to her thirst, but whose lives she was committed to protecting through her choice to follow vegetarian lifestyle that the Cullens had practiced for decades and that had allowed them to live among humans without killing them and without creating the kind of murder sprees that characterized nomadic vampires who fed on humans and who left trails of bodies that sometimes attracted human attention and sometimes attracted Volturi attention when secrecy was threatened. Learning to interact with humans without killing them required her to practice breathing techniques that minimized her exposure to human scent and required her to practice maintaining human speed and human strength. When instinct made her want to move faster and made her want to use full strength that would reveal her supernatural nature to observers, who might become suspicious if they saw her perform impossible feats, or if they noticed that she never ate food in their presence, or that her skin was unnaturally pale and unnaturally perfect, in ways that humans could not achieve through cosmetics or through any natural means. Her shield ability manifesting during her newborn year provided additional protection and provided additional tool that made her valuable to family and made her unique among vampires whose gifts typically enhance their offensive capabilities or enhance their sensory capabilities rather than providing defensive protection that could extend to others and that could block mental attacks from gifted vampires whose abilities required access to victims' consciousness to function properly and to achieve their intended effects. The shield discovery happened when Kate Denali attempted to use her electric shock ability on Bella during training session designed to test Bella's defensive capabilities, and when the shock failed to affect Bella at all, despite Kate's gift being powerful enough to incapacitate most vampires and powerful enough to cause significant pain even to those with high pain tolerance, or with gifts that provided some resistance to physical attacks and that would harm normal vampires. Bella's realization that she had always had mental shield explained why Edward could not read her thoughts during their entire relationship, and explained why Aro's gift had not worked on her during their encounter in Volterra, when he had touched her hand expecting to see her entire mental history, and had instead encountered blank void that frustrated him, and that made him want to acquire her for his collection of gifted vampires whose abilities he coveted and whose loyalty he purchased through promises of power and through threats of destruction if they refused his offers. Kate teaching her to extend shield to protect others required practice and required conscious effort to project the shield outward rather than keeping it wrapped tightly around her own mind where it had existed unconsciously throughout her human life and where it continued to exist automatically as vampire unless she made deliberate choice to extend it. and to cover other people with protection that would block mental attacks and would block gifts that required access to victims' mind to function properly and to achieve their intended effects, whether those effects were pain or paralysis or memory reading or emotional manipulation. Irina's sighting of Renesmee in the woods near Forks happened during the winter, when Irina had traveled from Alaska to Washington to reconcile with the Cullens and to apologize for missing the wedding and to mend the relationship that had been damaged by her refusal to celebrate Bella and Edward's union because of her ongoing grief about Laurent's death and because of her continued resentment toward the werewolves who had killed him and toward the Cullens who had allied with those werewolves, despite knowing that Laurent had been Irina's lover and that his death had caused her genuine pain that had not diminished with time and that continued to affect her relationships and her judgment about what constituted justice and what constituted betrayal of the bonds that should have existed between vampire allies who had known each other for centuries. Her visit was meant to be peace offering and was meant to restore the friendship between the Denali clan and the Cullen family, whose centuries-long alliance had been threatened by Irina's anger and by her absence from important family events that should have included their closest allies and their oldest friends in the vampire world, where alliances were crucial for survival and where enemies could become deadly threats without warning or without provocation, beyond perceived insults or perceived violations of unwritten codes that governed vampire society and that maintained the delicate balance between cooperation and conflict. Seeing Renesmee in the woods with Bella and Jacob created immediate shock and immediate horror as Irina observed what appeared to be a small child, with vampire characteristics playing in the snow and demonstrating abilities that no human child should possess and that no vampire child should possess, because vampire children were forbidden and because their creation was punishable by death for both the child and the creator, who had violated the most sacred law in vampire civilization that had existed for millennia and that had been enforced without exception by the Volturi, who tolerated no challenges to their authority and no violations of the laws they had established to protect vampire secrecy and to maintain vampire survival in a world where humans outnumbered them by millions to one, and where discovery would mean war, that vampires might not survive despite their individual superiority. Her assumption that Renesmee was an immortal child came from distance, and came from her lack of knowledge about hybrid possibilities that she had never encountered and had never heard about in her centuries of existence among vampires who believed that vampire human reproduction was impossible, and who had no reason to suspect that male vampires retained any fertility after transformation that stopped all biological processes and that made vampire bodies fundamentally different from human bodies that continued living and growing and changing throughout their mortal lifespans that were brief compared to vampire immortality. But that included possibilities for reproduction and for creating new life that vampires had lost. Why she made this mistake was understandable, given that Renesmee's appearance suggested child of perhaps 3 or 4 years, old based on her size and based on her physical development, even though she was only months old chronologically, and was actually hybrid rather than transformed human child, whose creation was absolutely forbidden under vampire law that existed to protect the species from exposure and to protect vampire society from the chaos that immortal children created through their inability to control bloodlust and their inability to keep secrets that would reveal vampire existence to humans, who would respond with fear and with violence that could threaten vampire populations despite vampire advantages in individual combat, and despite vampire superiority in strength and speed that made individual vampires nearly invincible against human opponents. Her ignorance of hybrids was complete and was shared by nearly every vampire in existence, because hybrid births were so rare that they might as well have been impossible. The specific circumstances required for conception being unlikely and being unknown. To most vampires who assumed that transformation eliminated all reproductive capacity for both males and females, without exception or without variation, across different individuals or different circumstances that might allow for the impossible to occur when biology defied expectations. Her immediate departure to Italy without investigating further came from her certainty that she had witnessed law breaking, and from a desire to report the Cullens to the Volturi before the immortal child could cause damage that would threaten vampire secrecy and would threaten the stability that Volturi authority maintained through enforcement of laws and through punishment of violators who endangered the species through recklessness or through deliberate rebellion against established rules that had kept vampire society functioning for thousands of years without major exposure incidents that would have revealed vampire existence to human populations and would have created the war that all vampires feared. Her motivation was not simply revenge for Laurent's death, although that certainly played role in her willingness to betray the Cullens to the Volturi, who would destroy them if her accusation was accurate, and if the Cullens had indeed created immortal child in violation of the most fundamental prohibition in vampire law, but was also genuine belief that she was doing her duty as responsible vampire who had witnessed serious crime and who needed to report it to authorities who would investigate and would punish appropriately according to vampire law that had existed for millennia and that had been enforced consistently by the Volturi, who tolerated no challenges to their authority and no violations of the laws they had created to maintain order and to prevent chaos that would threaten everyone. The immortal children history stretched back centuries to when vampires had created child vampires because of their cuteness and because of their innocent appearance that made them seem harmless and made them seem like they would be perfect, eternal companions who would never age and would never leave and would remain forever young and forever dependent on their creators, who wanted family and who wanted companionship that would last through eternity rather than ending through death or through abandonment, that characterized many vampire relationships when interest faded or when conflicts arose that could not be resolved through discussion or through compromise. What immortal children were specifically was humans transformed before reaching age of maturity and before developing the cognitive abilities and the emotional regulation that would allow them to control their bloodlust and to understand the need for secrecy that protected vampires from human discovery and from human retaliation that would occur if humans learned about vampire existence and organized systematic hunting that would threaten vampire survival despite vampire advantages in strength and speed, and sensory acuity that made individual vampires formidable opponents against individual humans, or even against groups of humans who lacked coordination or lacked knowledge about vampire weaknesses. Why they were created despite the obvious dangers came from vampire loneliness and from vampire desire for family and for companionship that would last forever, rather than ending through death or through separation that characterize human relationships that vampires could observe but could never truly participate in without revealing their nature and without creating complications that would ultimately require either transformation of the human or abandonment of the relationship before exposure occurred and before questions arose that could not be answered without revealing truths that would endanger the vampire and would endanger all vampires through the potential for exposure. The devastation they caused came from their inability to control bloodlust combined with their inability to understand consequences of their actions. Immortal children killing humans indiscriminately and creating patterns of death that attracted attention and created investigations and created danger for all vampires in the area, who might be discovered through the evidence that immortal children left in their wake as they satisfied their thirst without consideration for secrecy or for the survival of their species that depended on remaining hidden from human awareness. Their inability to keep secrets meant that they would eventually reveal vampire existence to humans, either deliberately through childish honesty or accidentally through their inability to maintain the constant pretense that adult vampires maintain to hide their true nature from human observation and from human curiosity, that might lead to questions that could not be answered without either lying extensively or revealing truths that would endanger everyone who existed in vampire society regardless of their personal involvement with immortal children or their personal responsibility for the exposure that would inevitably occur. The tantrums that immortal children threw when denied what they wanted resulted in destruction and resulted in deaths that could not be explained or could not be hidden, because the scale of violence exceeded what could be attributed to natural causes or to human criminals who might be blamed for murders that were actually committed by vampire children, whose strength was sufficient to tear apart adult humans and whose lack of control made them kill without discrimination or without awareness of the consequences their actions would have for the broader vampire community. The Great Purge that occurred centuries ago when the Volturi systematically hunted and destroyed all known immortal children and all the vampires who had created them, represented the Volturi's most extensive military action and represented their establishment of absolute authority over vampire civilization through demonstration of their willingness to destroy anyone who threatened the species, regardless of their age or their relationships or their previous alliances with Volturi leadership that might have protected them from lesser offenses, but that could not protect them from the consequences of creating immortal children whose existence threatened everyone. Why the law was absolute with no exceptions came from the existential threat that immortal children represented, and from the recognition that allowing even one immortal child to exist would create precedent that would encourage others to create more immortal children, and would eventually result in exposure and in war with humanity, that vampires might not survive despite their individual superiority, because humans had numbers and had weapons and had capacity for organized violence that could overwhelm vampire advantages if humans ever learned the truth and ever mobilized effectively against vampire populations that were scattered and were relatively small compared to human populations that numbered in billions. The penalty for creating an immortal child was death for both creator and child. the law recognizing no mitigating circumstances and accepting no excuses because the danger was too great and because mercy in one case would undermine the absolute prohibition that kept all vampires safe from the chaos that immortal children created wherever they existed and wherever they were allowed to survive long enough to create patterns of destruction that would eventually attract human attention and would eventually threaten vampire secrecy that had been maintained for millennia through careful discipline and through enforcement of laws that prevented exposure. The enforcement was swift and was final. Volturi guard traveling to investigate any report of immortal child and destroying everyone involved without trial and without appeal, because the crime was self-evident if immortal child existed, and because delay would allow the child to kill more humans and would increase the risk of exposure that threatened every vampire everywhere, regardless of their personal involvement in the creation of the immortal child or their personal knowledge of the violation. Alice's vision of the Volturi coming to Forks appeared suddenly during December when she was watching Renesmee play with Jacob and when she was enjoying the peace that had settled over the family after the chaos of Bella's transformation and after the anxiety about Renesmee's rapid growth had eased somewhat as they recognized that she was developing normally and was showing signs of stability rather than showing signs of imminent death through accelerated aging that would have claimed her before she reached maturity and before she could experience the life that her parents had hoped she would have despite the complications of her hybrid nature. The moment she saw the Volturi approaching in her vision created immediate panic and created immediate recognition that Irina must have seen Renesmee and must have reported her to the Volturi as immortal child without investigating or without considering alternative explanations for what she had witnessed in the woods near Forks, where the Cullens had believed they were safe and had believed they could raise Renesmee without interference from vampire authorities who would not know of her existence unless someone reported her to them through channels that connected local vampire communities to the Volturi leadership in Italy. The timeline revealed in Alice's vision showed that the Volturi would arrive in approximately 1 month, the delay suggesting they were gathering their entire guard and were preparing for major confrontation, rather than sending small investigative team that would assess the situation and report back before taking action. That might prove unnecessary if the accusation was false, or if the situation was more complex than initial reports suggested and required more nuanced response than immediate execution. Who was coming according to Alice's vision included not just the guard, but also the 3 ancient leaders Aro and Marcus and Caius, along with their wives Sulpicia and Athenodora, who rarely left Volterra, and whose presence indicated this was a significant event that required full display of Volturi power and full demonstration of their authority over vampire civilization that they had ruled for 3,000 years through combination of superior gifts and superior military force that had defeated all challengers and had maintained order through threat of destruction for anyone who violated their laws or who challenged their supremacy. The certainty that they intended to destroy the Cullens came from the vision showing their approach as military formation and showing their intentions as hostile rather than as investigative. The Volturi apparently having decided that Irina's report was credible and that the Cullens were guilty of creating immortal child without needing further investigation or without needing to see Renesmee directly before making judgment about her nature and about whether she violated vampire law that was absolute and that was enforced without mercy or without consideration for circumstances that might explain or might justify what appeared to be clear violation of the most fundamental prohibition in vampire society. The blank spots in Alice's vision that prevented her from seeing complete picture of what would happen included the werewolves, whose futures she could never see, because their presence created blind spots in her precognition, and included other elements that she could not identify, but that suggested her vision was incomplete, and that outcomes remained uncertain in ways that made planning difficult and made preparation challenging when they did not know what variables might affect the confrontation or might change the outcome from destruction to survival. Her immediate departure with Jasper was mysterious and was unexplained to the family, who did not understand why she would leave during crisis and why she would take Jasper with her when his military experience would be crucial for preparing defense if confrontation became inevitable, and if the Volturi refused to accept evidence that Renesmee was not immortal child, but was hybrid, whose existence did not violate any law, because hybrids had never been forbidden specifically, and had never been mentioned in any vampire law, because their existence had been believed to be impossible. The note she left was cryptic and provided no explanation beyond assurance that she was doing what was necessary and that they should trust her, even though her actions seemed like abandonment and seemed like betrayal when the family needed her most, and when her visions would be crucial for understanding what the Volturi intended and for preparing appropriate response that might prevent violence or might at least give them advantage if violence became unavoidable despite their best efforts at diplomacy. The family meeting that Carlyle called after Alice's departure brought everyone together in the Cullen House living room to discuss the situation and to make plans for how to respond to Volturi approach that would occur in approximately 1 month, according to Alice's vision that had been accurate in the past and that they had no reason to doubt now, despite their confusion about why Alice had left and what she intended to accomplish through her mysterious departure with Jasper, whose absence would weaken their defensive capabilities significantly if battle occurred. Carlyle's explanation of the situation to everyone included the history of immortal children and included the absolute prohibition against their creation, and included the penalty that awaited anyone who violated this law, regardless of circumstances or regardless of explanations that might justify the violation in moral terms, even if they could not justify it in legal terms that the Volturi recognized and enforced through their guard, whose gifts made them nearly invincible against most opponents. The realization that proof would not be enough to save them came from Carlyle's understanding of Volturi politics and from his knowledge that Aro had wanted to acquire Edward and Alice and now Bella for his guard, and that this accusation about immortal child might be excuse that Aro would use to either destroy the Cullens or to force them to join his guard under threat of death if they refused his offers that would be framed as generous opportunities rather than as coercion backed by threat of execution for their entire family. The Volturi's corruption and their use of law as weapon rather than as genuine protection for vampire society had been evident for centuries, but had been tolerated because no one had sufficient power to challenge their authority, and because most vampires benefited from the stability that Volturi enforcement provided even when that enforcement was occasionally unjust, or occasionally motivated by political considerations, rather than by genuine concern for vampire welfare or for vampire survival in a world where exposure would threaten everyone equally. The decision to gather witnesses from around the world represented Carlyle's diplomatic strategy for preventing violence through demonstrating that Renesmee was not immortal child, and through creating a situation where attacking would cost the Volturi more than it would benefit them, because they would face opposition from dozens of vampires who would testify to Renesmee's true nature, and who would fight to protect the Cullens if the Volturi refused to accept the evidence that was plainly visible to anyone who took time to observe Renesmee and to recognize that she was growing and was maturing in ways that immortal children never grew, because their development was frozen at the moment of transformation. Why witnesses mattered was not that they would fight that alongside the Cullens, although some might choose to do so if they believed the cause was just, but that they would observe and would testify and would spread word throughout vampire world if the Volturi destroyed the Cullens unjustly, and would undermine Volturi authority through their testimony about corruption and about abuse of power that went beyond law enforcement into tyranny that served Volturi interests, rather than serving vampire society's genuine needs for security and for protection from exposure. The risk of everyone who came to witness was substantial because association with lawbreakers could result in their own destruction if the Volturi decided that supporting the Cullens constituted conspiracy or constituted challenge to Volturi authority that needed to be punished to maintain their control over vampire civilization and to discourage others from questioning their judgments or their enforcement of laws that had existed for millennia. The courage required to come and to stand with the Cullens against the Volturi demonstrated the strength of relationships that Carlyle had built across centuries, and demonstrated the respect that many vampires had for his integrity and for his commitment to coexisting peacefully with humans, rather than viewing them simply as prey to be consumed without regard for their lives or their value as sentient beings who deserved consideration even from predators who were designed to hunt them. The witness gathering throughout December brought vampires from every continent and from every major vampire community that Carlyle had visited during his centuries of travel and during his decades of building relationships with other vampires who shared his philosophy or who at least respected his choices, even when they did not share his commitment to vegetarian lifestyle that required them to hunt animals rather than hunting humans whose blood was more satisfying and more nourishing, but whose deaths were morally problematic for vampires who retained their humanity and their compassion despite transformation that had changed their biology. The Amazon coven, consisting of Zafrina and Senna and Kachiri, came from the Brazilian rainforest, where they had lived for centuries, and where they had developed gifts that were particularly suited to their environment and to their lifestyle, as nomadic hunters who traveled through territories that were vast and were largely unpopulated by humans, whose presence was minimal in the deep jungle where the coven made their home. The Irish coven, consisting of Siobhan and Liam and Maggie, came from Ireland, where they had maintained residence for decades, and where Siobhan's gift for influencing outcomes through her will made her particularly valuable ally in confrontation, where belief and determination might shape what actually occurred, and might affect whether violence erupted or whether peaceful resolution could be achieved through demonstration of Renesmee's true nature. The Egyptian coven consisting of Benjamin and Tia and Amun and Kebi represented one of the oldest vampire communities outside of the Volturi themselves, their presence lending credibility to the Cullen's position and their testimony carrying weight because of their age and because of their reputation for avoiding politics and avoiding conflicts that did not directly concern them or that did not threaten their own security in ways that required their intervention. The Romanian coven, consisting only of Vladimir and Stefan, represented the ancient enemies of the Volturi, who had ruled vampire civilization before the Volturi had overthrown them and had destroyed their empire and had scattered their followers across Europe and across the world. In purge that had eliminated most of the Romanian coven's supporters and had established Volturi supremacy that had lasted for 3,000 years without serious challenge. Their ancient grudge against the Volturi made them eager to witness any challenge to Volturi authority and made them willing to risk destruction themselves if there was any possibility that the Volturi might be weakened or might be destroyed through confrontation with the Cullens and their allies who had gathered to defend Renesmee against unjust accusation based on Irina's misunderstanding of what she had witnessed. The European nomads, including Alistair and Charles and McKenna, came individually rather than as covens, their solitary natures making them reluctant to commit to any group, but their respect for Carlyle making them willing to at least witness and to testify to what they observed, even if they would not fight if confrontation became violent, and if the Volturi decided to attack despite the evidence that Renesmee was not immortal child. Peter and Charlotte came from Jasper's past, when he had been part of Southern Vampire Wars, and when he had fought in newborn armies that Maria had created to expand her territory and to defend against rivals who wanted to control the same regions of Mexico and Texas, where vampire politics were violent and were unstable in ways that northern covens rarely experienced. The Denali clan's arrival without Irina brought Tanya and Kate and Garrett and Eliza and Carmen to stand with the Cullens despite their sister's betrayal and despite their grief about what Irina had done and what consequences her report to the Volturi would bring for everyone involved in the confrontation that would occur when the Volturi arrived to investigate the accusation that she had made. The field chosen for the confrontation was snowy clearing north of Forks that provided open space where both sides could position themselves and could observe each other without obstacles blocking their views or providing cover that might create tactical advantages for either party in what everyone hoped would remain peaceful encounter, but what might become battlefield if the Volturi refused to accept evidence and refused to acknowledge that Renesmee was not immortal child, but was hybrid, whose existence violated no laws because hybrids had never been specifically forbidden in vampire legislation that focused on immortal children created through transformation rather than through natural conception. The date of January 31st had been determined by Alice's vision as the day when the Volturi would arrive, the timing giving the Cullens and their witnesses approximately 1 month to prepare and to gather everyone who would stand with them and would testify about Renesmee's true nature if given opportunity to speak and to present evidence before violence erupted. The positioning of witnesses versus guards created clear division across the clearing, with the Cullens and their allies forming defensive line on one side, while leaving space for the Volturi to approach from the opposite side where forest provided cover for their arrival and provided staging area where they could organize themselves before emerging into the open where confrontation would occur. The two sides facing each other created tableaux that resembled ancient battles where armies met on chosen ground and where negotiations preceded violence if negotiations failed to resolve disputes that had brought enemies into conflict. The wolves hidden in the forest surrounding the clearing provided additional security and provided backup if battle erupted. Jacob's pack and Seth's presence representing the alliance between vampires and werewolves that had been forged through Renesmee's existence and through Jacob's imprint that made him devoted protector willing to fight alongside vampires despite his natural enmity toward creatures who were designed to be his enemies. The atmospheric tension in the clearing was palpable and was visible in the stillness of the vampires who waited and in the silence that preceded the Volturi's arrival, when even breathing seemed too loud and when every sound from the forest created alertness and created readiness for confrontation that might begin at any moment without warning or without opportunity for explanation before violence commenced. The snow covering the ground reflected sunlight that made vampire skin sparkle and made their supernatural nature visible in ways that would have revealed them to any human observer who might have witnessed the gathering. But the isolation of the location ensured that no humans would stumble upon the confrontation and would witness what occurred between vampire factions whose conflict could reshape vampire politics and could challenge Volturi authority that had remained unchallenged for 3 millennia. The Volturi arrival happened exactly as Alice had foreseen, with the entire guard emerging from the forest in formation that demonstrated their military discipline and that displayed their power through their numbers and through their coordinated movements that suggested centuries of training and centuries of fighting together as unit that functioned with precision that exceeded what most vampire covens could achieve. Aro and Marcus and Caius walked at the center of the formation, surrounded by their most powerful guard members whose gifts provided protection and provided offensive capabilities that made the Volturi nearly invincible in direct combat against opponents who lacked equivalent gifts or equivalent numbers to overwhelm the guard through sheer force. The wives Sulpicia and Athenodora positioned themselves in the rear of the formation, where they would be protected if violence erupted, their presence indicating that the Volturi had expected this to be a significant event rather than routine investigation that could be handled by a smaller contingent of guards without requiring the presence of all 3 ancient leaders and their wives, who rarely traveled from Volterra, where they lived in luxury and in security that their husbands' power provided. The guard members and their gifts created impressive display of supernatural abilities that exceeded what most vampires possessed. Jane's pain illusion gift and Alec's sensory deprivation gift being the most feared because they could incapacitate opponents without physical contact and without warning that would allow victims to defend themselves or to escape before the gifts took effect. Dimitri's tracking ability made escape impossible for anyone the Volturi wanted to find. His gift allowing him to follow anyone anywhere in the world, regardless of how far they ran or how well they hid from pursuit. Felix's physical strength exceeded even normal vampire strength and made him a formidable opponent in hand-to-hand combat. where his size and his power allowed him to overpower most vampires through brute force alone. Chelsea's relationship manipulation gift allowed her to break bonds between mates and between coven members, her ability making her valuable for recruiting vampires for the guard by severing their attachments to their previous covens and by creating loyalty to the Volturi that replaced their former allegiances. Renata served as Aro's personal shield, her gift creating physical barrier that deflected attacks and that made Aro nearly impossible to harm directly, because anyone attempting to strike him would find themselves redirected away from their target before they could make contact. The other guard members, whose names were less well known, but whose gifts were equally impressive, included vampires with enhanced senses and vampires with abilities that affected emotions or that affected physical capabilities of opponents in ways that made the Volturi guard the most powerful vampire military force in existence and made challenging them suicidal for most covens who lacked the numbers or the gifts necessary to compete. The theatrical nature of their approach demonstrated the Volturi's preference for ceremony and for displays of power that reinforced their authority and that intimidated opponents before negotiations even began. Their slow advance across the clearing designed to create psychological pressure and designed to demonstrate their confidence that they would prevail regardless of how many witnesses the Cullens had gathered, or how many vampires were willing to stand against Volturi judgment. The formation maintained perfect alignment as they crossed the snowy field, each guard member positioned precisely according to their role and according to their gifts in organization that had been practiced countless times, and that reflected the Volturi's centuries of experience in military operations that had eliminated all their rivals and that had established their supremacy over vampire civilization. Carlyle's diplomacy initiated the confrontation when he stepped forward from the Cullen line and addressed Aro directly with formal greeting that acknowledged their friendship and that acknowledged the centuries they had known each other despite being on opposite sides of this particular conflict. His explanation about Renesmee emphasized her hybrid nature through careful wording that made clear she was not immortal child and that made clear she had been born rather than being created through transformation that was forbidden under vampire law. His offer for Aro to see truth for himself through Aro's gift of reading complete mental history of anyone he touched represented Carlyle's confidence that the evidence would be sufficient to prove Renesmee's innocence and to prove that the Cullens had violated no laws through her existence. His centuries-old friendship with Aro being tested created emotional dimension to the confrontation that transcended legal questions about whether laws had been broken. The personal relationship between the two leaders adding complexity to a situation that might have been simpler if they had been strangers or if they had been enemies without shared history that included mutual respect and included genuine affection, despite their different philosophies about how vampires should live and how vampire society should be organized. His calm, despite the threat, demonstrated his faith in the evidence and his faith in Aro's rationality, even though he recognized that Aro's desire to acquire gifted vampires for his guard might override his friendship and might override his commitment to justice if he believed he could use this situation to force the Cullens into his service. Aro's investigation began when he accepted Carlyle's invitation to see the truth through direct mental contact that would reveal everything Edward knew about Renesmee's conception and birth and development. His reading of Edward's entire history took several minutes, as he absorbed every thought Edward had ever had, and every memory Edward had accumulated during his century as vampire, the process visible to observers through Aro's changing expressions that revealed his genuine surprise and his genuine fascination as he learned about the pregnancy and learned about the hybrid biology that no one had believed was possible before Renesmee's existence had proved otherwise. Seeing Edward's memories of Renesmee's birth and growth provided evidence that could not be disputed or could not be dismissed as fabrication, because Aro's gift showed him truth without filters and without possibility of deception. That might have been possible through verbal testimony, that could be lies, or that could be misunderstandings. His fascination with Bela's shield became apparent when he attempted to read her mind and discovered that her mental defenses blocked his gift completely and prevented him from accessing her thoughts or her memories in ways that frustrated him and that made him want to acquire her for his guard even more urgently than he had wanted her before witnessing her defensive capabilities that exceeded any shield he had previously encountered. His attempt to use Chelsea to break family bonds and to make the Cullens vulnerable to recruitment failed because Bella's shield extended to protect everyone around her and prevented Chelsea's gift from affecting their relationships or from severing the connections that bound them together as family, that would not be separated through manipulation or through coercion, that relied on supernatural abilities rather than on genuine persuasion. His desire to acquire Alice and Edward and Bella for his guard became more obvious as the confrontation progressed, his questions and his comments revealing that he viewed this situation as opportunity to add powerful gifted vampires to his collection, rather than viewing it primarily as law enforcement that required him to investigate accusations and to punish violations if violations had occurred. Renesmee's presentation to the Volturi happened when Bella carried her forward across the snow toward where Aro stood, waiting to examine the child who had been reported as immortal child, but who appeared to be something entirely different from what vampire law prohibited. Renesmee touching Aro's face and showing him her story through her gift of thought projection provided evidence that exceeded even Edward's memories, because it came directly from Renesmee herself, and because it showed her consciousness and showed her development in ways that made clear she was not frozen child, but was growing person who would mature and would stabilize, rather than remaining dangerous infant forever. Aro's genuine surprise at the hybrid demonstrated that even he, with his 3,000 years of experience and his extensive knowledge of vampire history, had never encountered anything like Renesmee, and had never imagined that such being could exist through natural reproduction, rather than through transformation. His scientific interest in the impossible became apparent through his questions about her abilities and about her growth rate and about her diet that combined blood and human food in ways that distinguished her from pure vampires, whose biology required blood exclusively and who could not digest normal food without illness. His question about whether she would become danger when fully grown revealed his concern about whether hybrids posed long-term threat to vampire secrecy, and whether allowing her to exist would create precedent that might lead to more hybrids whose nature might be less benign than Renesmee's nature appeared to be based on current evidence. The witnesses' testimonies provided additional evidence through multiple vampires stepping forward to present what they had observed during their time with Renesmee, and during their interactions with her that had demonstrated her intelligence and her control and her growth that proved she was not immortal child. Each coven, presenting what they had observed, added weight to the case that Renesmee was fundamentally different from immortal children, whose characteristics had been well documented during the centuries before they were all destroyed in the Great Purge. Their statements that Renesmee was growing and learning emphasized the key distinction between hybrid who matured and immortal child who remained frozen at age of transformation without development or without the capacity for growth that characterized living beings, rather than characterizing undead beings whose vampire nature prevented change. Their declarations that she was not immortal child created unified testimony from dozens of witnesses who had no reason to lie and who risked their own safety by standing against the Volturi if the Volturi chose to reject evidence and chose to destroy the Cullens regardless of proof. Their willingness to testify against the Volturi if needed demonstrated the courage that Carlisle's diplomacy had inspired and demonstrated the respect that many vampires had for truth and for justice, even when supporting truth meant opposing the most powerful vampire authority in existence. The Romanians' barely concealed hope for violence added tension, because Vladimir and Stefan wanted confrontation and wanted opportunity to see Volturi weaken or destroyed through battle that might finally avenge their ancient loss. Irina's execution happened swiftly after Caius demanded justice for false accusation that had brought the Volturi to Forks on what appeared to be mistaken report rather than being legitimate law enforcement. Irina's realization she had been wrong came too late to save her life. Her apology to the Cullens expressing genuine remorse, but failing to prevent her punishment for wasting Volturi time and for creating international incident that had gathered dozens of witnesses and had challenged Volturi authority through questioning their judgment. Her acceptance of punishment demonstrated her recognition that she deserved consequences for her actions, even though her mistake had been honest error rather than being malicious lie intended to harm the Cullens. The swift execution by the guard happened before anyone could protest or could intervene, the Volturi's justice being immediate and being final without appeals or without mercy that might have spared her if circumstances had been different. The Denali covens restrained grief as Tanya and Kate and Eliza and Carmen watched their sister destroyed, demonstrated their discipline and their recognition that protesting would accomplish nothing, except potentially making them targets as well, if the Volturi interpreted their grief as challenge to Volturi authority. Garrett, holding Kate back, prevented her from attacking in grief-fueled rage that would have resulted in her own destruction without saving Irina, or without changing the outcome that had been determined the moment Caius demanded punishment for the false accusation. The warning this sent to all present was clear and was unmistakable. The casual destruction of Irina demonstrating that the Volturi would tolerate no challenges and would punish anyone who inconvenienced them regardless of whether actions had been intentional or whether they had been mistakes made in good faith without malicious intent. The stalemate that followed Irina's execution came from Arrow's dilemma about whether to attack when no legal justification existed, but when his desire to acquire gifted Cullens remained unfulfilled, and when Caius pushed for violence regardless of evidence because he wanted excuse to destroy Coven that had dared to ally with werewolves and had dared to gather witnesses against Volturi authority. Alice's return with Jasper and with mysterious vampire from South America interrupted the tense standoff and provided resolution that no one had anticipated during the months of preparation and during the gathering of witnesses who had come to testify. The immediate peace that settled over the snowy field after the Volturi's retreat brought relief that was overwhelming and was physical. The tension that had gripped everyone for weeks finally releasing as they watched the Volturi guard disappear into the forest, and as they recognized that Renesmee had been spared, and that their family had survived intact without losing members to battle that everyone had feared was inevitable, despite their best efforts at diplomacy, and despite the evidence they had gathered to prove her innocence. The return to the Cullen house happened gradually as witnesses said goodbye, and as alliances that had been forged through crisis were acknowledged and were celebrated through embraces and through promises to remain in contact and to support each other if future threats emerged that required cooperation between covens who had previously existed independently without strong connections to other vampire communities beyond their immediate territories. The celebration of survival was subdued because of Irina's execution and because of the recognition that they had come within moments of battle that would have killed dozens and would have changed vampire politics forever through confrontation that might have weakened Volturi authority or might have strengthened it depending on outcome that remained unknowable because Alice's timely return with Nahuel had prevented violence from erupting. Witnesses saying goodbye with new alliances formed represented lasting impact to the confrontation that had brought together vampires from around the world and had created connections that would persist across decades and would create network of relationships that might eventually challenge Volturi's supremacy through coordinated resistance rather than through direct military confrontation that would be suicidal for individual covens, but might be possible for coalition of allied vampires. The Denali coven's grief over Irina was genuine and was profound. Their loss of sister creating pain that would persist for decades and would affect their relationships with the Cullens, who bore some responsibility for the situation, even though Irina's mistake had been her own choice and had been her own action that brought consequences she should have anticipated. Their gratitude for the Cullens' survival balanced their grief and created complex emotional response that acknowledged both the tragedy of Irina's death and the relief that more deaths had not occurred through battle that would have claimed many victims on both sides. Garrett and Kate's relationship, solidified through crisis, demonstrated the way extreme circumstances created bonds between people who might not have connected under normal conditions. Their mutual respect and their mutual attraction developing into genuine partnership that would last across centuries and would give both of them companionship they had lacked during their previous solitary existences. Benjamin and Tia's admiration for Bella's shield and for her control as newborn vampire created friendship between Egyptian coven and Cullen family that would persist and would create opportunities for future cooperation if circumstances required assistance or required alliance against threats that might emerge. The Romanians' disappointment at the peaceful resolution was visible in their expressions and was audible in their comments about missed opportunity to see Volturi weakened through battle that might have damaged their reputation or might have eliminated some of their most powerful guard members. but their respect for the Cullens' diplomatic victory acknowledged that peaceful resolution was strategically superior, even if it was less satisfying emotionally for vampires who had spent millennia waiting for revenge against the Volturi, who had destroyed their empire. Alice's explanation of why she left during Crisis and why she took Jasper with her revealed that she had been searching for proof that hybrids matured safely and that they reached stability rather than dying young through accelerated aging that would have made Renesmee's long-term survival impossible. How she found Nahuel came from her visions leading her to South America, where she had followed glimpses of male hybrid whose existence proved that Renesmee was not unique and that hybrid biology allowed for normal lifespan rather than requiring early death, that everyone had feared might claim her before she reached maturity. Jasper's role in protecting her during the surge had been crucial because traveling without companion was dangerous even for vampire with Alice's gift for seeing future threats, his military experience and his combat abilities ensuring her safety, while she pursued the evidence that would save their family. The risk they took leaving the family during Crisis was substantial because their absence had weakened defensive capabilities and had created anxiety about whether they had abandoned everyone to face Volturi alone. But their trust in Carlisle's diplomacy and their faith that evidence they sought would be more valuable than their presence during confrontation had been justified by outcome that had saved Renesmee without requiring battle that might have killed family members. Why she could not tell anyone about her plan related to keeping the information hidden from Arrow's eventual reading of Edward's mind. Her recognition that any knowledge of her search would have been revealed to Arrow when he touched Edward and would have alerted him to expect additional evidence that he might have prepared to counter or to dismiss if he had known it was coming. Bella's shield revelation and her discovery that she could control it completely and could allow Edward into her mind for first time in their relationship created intimacy that transcended physical connection and created understanding between them that had been impossible when her shield had blocked him from experiencing her thoughts directly. Finally allowing Edward into her mind after years of him being unable to read her represented trust and represented vulnerability that she had never been able to share with him during her human life when her shield had been unconscious, defense that she could not control or could not lower even when she wanted to share her inner experience with him. Showing him all her thoughts and memories gave him access to her complete mental history and gave him perspective on their relationship from her point of view, rather than from his assumptions about what she felt or what she thought about events they had experienced together. Edward experiencing her love for him from her perspective overwhelmed him and created emotional response that was visible to everyone who witnessed his reaction. His century of loneliness and his decades of believing he was monster unworthy of love being contradicted by the depth and the purity of Bella's devotion that had existed since she first met him, and that had persisted through every danger and through every obstacle that should have convinced her to abandon him and to choose safer life with someone who was not vampire and was not threat to her survival. His overwhelming emotion at seeing how she had always loved him validated her sacrifice and validated her transformation and validated all the choices they had made together, despite opposition from family members who had believed she was making a mistake by choosing immortality for sake of being with him forever. Renesmee's future remained uncertain in some ways because Carlyle's documentation of her growth had not yet determined exactly when she would reach maturity or exactly how long her lifespan would be. But the projected timeline to maturity of approximately 7 years based on her current rate of development suggested she would reach physical and mental adulthood while still being chronologically young, compared to humans who took 18 years to reach similar developmental stage. Her unique position as bridge between species gave her opportunities that neither pure vampires nor pure humans possessed. Her ability to exist in both worlds and her ability to connect with both vampires and werewolves through Jacob's imprint, making her potentially important figure in future relationships between supernatural communities that had historically been enemies. Jacob's imprint meaning she would always have protection created security that allowed family to relax somewhat about threats she might face from vampires who feared hybrids or from humans who might discover her nature and might respond with violence or with attempts to capture her for study. Her potential lifespan remained unknown, but appeared likely to be extended beyond human norms, even if she was not fully immortal like pure vampires, whose existence lasted indefinitely without aging or without death through natural causes. The family she would grow up with provided support and provided love that would sustain her through challenges she would face as hybrid, whose nature made her unique and made her potentially vulnerable to those who feared difference or who wanted to eliminate what they did not understand. The cottage life that Bella and Edward established after the confrontation provided them with privacy and provided them with sanctuary, where they could explore their relationship as equals rather than as human and vampire, whose difference in strength and whose difference in durability had created imbalance during Bella's human life. Their home as sanctuary represented new beginning and represented the future they had fought for during months of pregnancy and during weeks of confrontation with Volturi, who had threatened to destroy everything they loved. Renée, visiting daily, maintained family connections and maintained her relationship with both her parents, who shared custody informally with Rosalie, whose devotion to Renée had not diminished after the crisis ended and after peace returned. The balance between privacy and family created healthy dynamic that allowed Bella and Edward to be couple, while also being parents who remained connected to extended family, whose support had made survival possible, and whose love had sustained them through dangers that would have destroyed less united coven. Vampire intimacy and connection between mates created bond that exceeded what human relationships could achieve, because vampire senses enhanced every experience, and because vampire memory preserved every moment with perfect clarity that would allow them to remember this beginning across centuries they would spend together. Edward's century of waiting, rewarded through his partnership with Bella, represented fulfillment of hopes he had abandoned decades earlier, when loneliness had convinced him that he would never find companion who could accept his nature and could love him despite what he was and despite what he had done during his rebellious years when he had hunted humans. The family dynamic settled into patterns that would persist across decades as Rosalie's fulfillment through Renée gave her purpose that 7 decades of vampire existence had not provided. Emmett's joy at the complete family made him even more cheerful than usual. Jasper's peace after preparing for battle that never happened allowed him to relax somewhat. Alice's contentment with her visions secure meant she could enjoy present without constantly monitoring future threats, and Carlyle and Esme's pride in their family validated their centuries of building coven. Based on choice, rather than on convenience or on necessity, that characterized most vampire relationships. The coven stronger than ever through shared experience of facing existential threat and surviving through cooperation rather than through violence represented ideal that Carlyle had worked toward for centuries and represented proof that vampires could choose different paths than the path of violence and domination that characterize most vampire politics. Charlie's acceptance of Bella in her new form and his relationship with his granddaughter, whose existence he could not fully explain, created family connection that bridged supernatural and human worlds. Sue Clearwater's integration into his life provided him with companion who understood supernatural elements through her own children's transformations into werewolves, and the family dinners that continued despite Bella's inability to eat human food, maintained appearances and maintained relationship between father and daughter, whose bond had survived Bella's transformation, even though their relationship would never be completely honest about what Bella had become. Jacob's place in the family as Renesmee's protector and as Edward's unlikely friend represented healing and represented growth beyond old enmities. His friendship with the Cullens solidified through his imprint and through his recognition that they loved Renesmee as much as he loved her, and that protecting her required cooperation rather than requiring competition for her affection. So rest now, Twilight souls, with the knowledge that even impossible circumstances can resolve peacefully when evidence overcomes prejudice and when witnesses speak truth to power that would otherwise destroy innocence. The saga complete and the family safe and the forever begun for Bella and Edward and Renesmee, whose existence proved that love creates possibilities that biology declares impossible and that law declares forbidden, but that life creates anyway, when circumstances align and when courage overcomes fear of consequences. Let these hidden secrets settle into dreams, where Breaking Dawn's mysteries become clear, and where the Cullens' survival becomes testimony to the power of family and the power of truth, to overcome even ancient authority that claims absolute power over life and death. Good night.